21. Ilya closed the door to the bedchamber behind her and put her back to it, giving Paul one of those looks he had come to recognize over the years as significant and serious. Her hair had fallen charmingly over one eye, with a suggestion of flirtation, but the expression in her eyes was not in the least amatory.
"Are you aware that Eleanor is in love with that boy?"
she asked peremptorily. Paul sighed. He would have so much preferred not to deal with this until after he'd had Ilya to himself for a while. He took the candles out of their sconces around the rooms, lit them at the fire, and replaced them to give himself time to think. "I would have said infatuated rather than in love, but yes," he replied with resignation. He knew as well as Ilya that Lan was that boy and not Tuck, nor any other boy of their acquaintance. There was no point in prevaricating with questions of which boy she meant. He sat on the edge of the canopied bed, the only furniture in the room, and waited for her reply.
"At her age they're the same,"
Ilya responded, giving vent to her agitation in pacing back and forth in the confines of the little room, but never taking her eyes off her husband.
"Well?"
"Well, what?" he asked, reasonably, he thought, but she rolled her eyes upward as if asking the heavens for help with his denseness.
"Well, what are you doing about it?"
"Nothing. She's not likely to confide in any mere male, and especially not her father," he pointed out. "And it wasn't my idea to bring her along, it was the King's, and Jedin's. They only know that she's Lan's friend, and they want friends around him to keep him sane. The fact that she's a mind healer was just that much more reason to send her. I'm hoping now that in constant contact with Lavan, she's going to wear out her passion against his indifference. Or failing that, she'll take one look at the battlefield and beg you to take her back home." Ilya relaxed a little, as if he'd put at least one of her fears to rest, and stopped pacing.
"You're sure he's indifferent?"
she asked. Begged, rather. Paul sighed again, shook his head, and patted the top of the bed beside him. She accepted the silent invitation and sat beside him, pulling her legs up onto the quilted coverlet and curling up against his shoulder. "Lan couldn't be anything but indifferent to Eleanor, or any girl for that matter. He's already life-bonded. To his companion," he added, to cut through any more questions. Ilya squirmed around and looked into his face, her own features a mask of incredulity.
"You aren't joking?"
she exclaimed, stunned and even a little shocked.
"Oh, no. Poor Eleanor."
"And poor Lan, and poor Kalira. That's his companion," he replied. "Herald bond and life bond. They're never out of each other's heads, and if anything happens to Kalira, Lan just goes crazy." He shook his head. "When she was hurt, he couldn't think of anything else, and it was no use attempting to get him to try. No one his age should have to cope with a full life bond. It's not healthy. He doesn't even know who he is yet, but now he's inextricably bound up with someone who isn't his age, his sex, or even human."
"But apparently in his case it's necessary,"
she brooded, putting her head back on his shoulder with a sigh of her own.
"If what I've heard is true, she's the controlling force on his gift?"
"Exactly, and I'm not sure she could do that if they weren't life-bonded. But he's never going to be himself, whole and entire, and he's never going to be independent. Is he?" he asked her doubtfully, leaning back against the pillows and making them both more comfortable.
"Ask Eleanor. I'm not the mind healer. Or, rather," she corrected hastily, "don't ask Eleanor. I'd rather she didn't take him on as a cause. There's nothing more certain of cementing misplaced infatuation into permanency than being needed."
Paul heard the inflection that turned the word into an icon, and he agreed with her. I talked with her back when I first saw this happening, he said, hastening to let her know that he hadn't shirked his parental duties. I tried. I really tried to make her understand that she couldn't hope to compete. I tried. Ilya wrapped her arms around him, and he relaxed into her embrace. Gods, it's so good to be with her again.
I know you did, and I know you didn't try anything as stupid as flatly opposing her, she said into his ear. Nothing feeds romance like opposition, and you know it.
Thank you for that, my love, and for your confidence in my good sense.
She'll talk to me about it sooner rather than later, I think,
Ilya continued, as her hair tickled his nose and he tucked it under his chin.
I don't know what else I can do, but at least I can keep track of how she's feeling.
Satyran reminds me fairly often that parents can't cushion the blows our children set themselves up for, he murmured into her ear, breathing in the warm scent of herbs that always clung to her.
I'm not going to think any more about it until tomorrow,
she said firmly. He was perfectly willing to go along with her on that score. Mid-morning, and they were less than half a day from the southern border and the war, and yet there was no sign of the conflict here other than the wear on the roads. They were no longer on the main roads. This was the way that Ilya had passed coming up here, and they were all returning to report to the main quarters of the Lord Marshal. This was a pine forest, a very old one. The scent was fantastic in here, but the boughs all overhung the road, completely blocking the sun and leaving them in half-light no brighter than twilight. Paul led the way, unburdened for once. Ilya was up behind Lan and Eleanor behind Tuck. Ilya was a perfect passenger, actually. She was friendly and made intelligent conversation. Lan much preferred her to Eleanor.
We moved the headquarters to White Foal Pass just before I left, Ilya told him. That's why this little road hasn't been trampled to bare dirt yet. It looked to the Lord Marshal as if the Carsites were going to make a big push there. It would be the logical place to go with as large a force as they have. White Foal is the only pass where they get big numbers of men through quickly.
Not to mention the value of pushing us back at White Foal Pass, Lan replied grimly. There's an awful lot of symbolic significance there, if even I can see that. Ilya nodded. He felt her hair move against his shoulder. Then, before he could continue his thought, something dropped down out of the tree ahead of them. Frozen between shock and total terror, Lan jerked on the reins and Kalira shied sideways. He landed on the pillion behind Paul, knocking Satyran sideways with the unexpected weight. Hooves skidded on the icy road. Satyran shrieked as his hind feet slid out from underneath him, but the black-hooded man grabbed Paul around the chest and shoulders and pulled him sideways. They tumbled to the ground together, Paul fighting to get his arms free and shouting, Satyran scrambling to get his feet under him again. Eleanor screamed, and kept screaming, a high, thin, terror-filled wail. Ilya didn't make a sound, but her hands clutched Lan's upper arms so tightly it hurt. Lan's stomach flipped, but it was the only part of him that could move. He couldn't even breathe. The man had a knife, a black-bladed knife that didn't reflect light at all. It drew Lan's eyes and filled his gaze as the man brandished it. He'd wrapped his legs around Paul's body, trapping Paul's arms so the herald couldn't get to his weapons. He shouted something as he and Paul struggled on the ground. It was Karsite. Something about demons.
Lan!
Kalira shouted at him, but he couldn't shake off his paralysis. The attacker grabbed Paul's hair, pulling his head back. Satyran, still shrieking a battle cry, whirled. His hooves pounded the ground a hair away from Paul, but he couldn't trample the man and not get Paul, too. Tuck fought with Eleanor to keep her from leaping into the fray. Ilya, frozen and rigid, only whimpered. The dragon within Lan flamed into life with a roar, ready to kill.
Taste of metal, of blood, the taste of anger.
The dragon uncoiled in a rush, craving death, fire, destruction. It lunged at the restraints that held it, raged against the bindings, filling Lan's mind and soul with a dreadful lust.
No.
He couldn't. That was a man, not a bundle of straw.
Lan!
Kalira shouted at him.
No!
This was all happening too fast. He couldn't think.
Flames washing through him, straining his control.
Only fire would save his friend. He had to let the dragon kill.
No.
Paul was a fighter. Surely he would free himself. Lan couldn't kill a man. As the man struck at Paul's throat, Paul wrenched his head down and to the side, and his hands grabbed the man's feet, twisting in a move Lan had seen Odo demonstrate a dozen times. Lan's heart pounded. His head felt full to bursting. Blood fountained as the man slashed his knife across Paul's eyes instead of his throat. Blood gushing everywhere, staining the snow, dyeing the whites a terrible crimson. And something inside Lan parted with a snap.
Yes, 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 yes.
Paul screamed. Ilya and Tuck screamed. Eleanor was still screaming. Lan's throat closed, his hands clenched on the reins, and his vision tunneled. But the car sight exploded into flame.
Fire, death, rage, hate.
Ilya scrambled down from the pillion, running for Paul. Lan barely noticed. He was bathed in fire, tiny flamelets dancing from the tips of his fingers, floating in the air around him. This was what he had been born for. The dragon within him exulted in its freedom, and ravaged the car site within and without. Bound to the dragon, one with the dragon. He was the dragon now, and the dragon was rage and flame and hunger. The car site died instantly, but death was not enough, not nearly enough. He spun in a circle of fire and danced a volta of revenge, as the car site burned and burned and burned. The knife fell as Paul tried to squirm out of the way, and the blackened steel sliced across his face. Gods! A streak of agony, darkness, the hot gush of his own blood over his cheeks. He screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, but kept fighting. The next stroke could be the final one. He held to consciousness and twisted the car site's ankles until the man himself shouted in pain, then wrenched himself free of the car site somehow, still screaming in agony. He scrambled away over the snow on hands and knees, horrible pain making him want to curl himself into a ball and just lie there screaming. He heard a strange sound behind him, as if something very large and soft had plummeted out of the sky to land in the snow as he scrambled, blind and still howling with agony, toward the place where he thought the rest of them were. Teeth grabbed his collar and hauled him unceremoniously out of harm's way, dropping him literally in Ilya's lap. Only then did he fall into blessed unconsciousness.
Lan! Lan!
Lan ignored the mind voice until it resorted to a sort of mind kick that finally got his attention. Shaken out of his entrancement, this time the mind voice penetrated the wash of fire and the terrible joy.
Lan, enough! Paul needs you!
Oh, gods! He shook his head and wrenched himself out of the meld with the dragon, fighting to get his eyes open. Without his full attention feeding it, the dragon found itself quickly enchanted again by Kalira. Suddenly, it coiled itself deep inside his mind and dropped into uneasy slumber. Jolted back into the real world, Lan opened his eyes on a black patch in the snow that held nothing. Nothing but a bit of melted metal. Not a body, not even bones. Nothing but ashes. Ilya sat on the bare road, Paul's bloody head in her lap, a frown of fierce concentration in her face. The gash across Paul's eyes closed even as Lan watched, but there was no doubt that the knife had cut right across Paul's eyes, blinding him, perhaps forever. Gut-wrenching guilt hit him and nearly knocked him out of the saddle.
"Oh, gods, what have I done?" "Don't sit there feeling sorry for yourself,"
Ilya snarled with a touch of hysteria in her voice, without looking up.
"I need hot water and bandages, and I need them now. And a fire before he goes into shock. And don't wallow in guilt until after you've got it going."
Eleanor was useless. That much was obvious. She knelt in the snow and sobbed into her hands next to her father. That left Lan and Tuck. Lan went for wood while Tuck slid off his companion and emptied the contents of all the saddlebags onto the ground. When Lan returned with the wood, afoot now with the wood piled onto Kalira's back, Tuck had spread blankets over the snow and Paul lay on them, his face neatly bandaged. There was a strange scent in the air, not of burned meat, but a metallic scent, hot stone and scorched earth. Lan piled the wood near Paul and Ilya and ignited it, turning it into a roaring fire in an instant. As he went back for more wood, Ilya pushed a small pot holding clean snow near the flames to melt for water. When he returned the second time, Eleanor was finally doing something, cleaning some of the blood off her father's face and clothing and helping her mother, although she was sobbing as she worked. Tuck was off getting more wood himself. Ilya was on the verge of hysteria.
"I can't stop now,"
she shouted at Eleanor in response to a tear-choked entreaty.
"I am not going to let your father go blind. I will heal him, I swear it, if I have to die trying."
At that, Eleanor took her hands off her mother's and grabbed Ilya's shoulders, shaking her.
"And what good would that do?"
she shrieked, as Ilya went limp with surprise and her head jerked back and forth from the shaking.
"You'll kill him if you die."
That seemed to snap Ilya out of her crazed state. She stared at Eleanor in shock, then the two of them fell into each other's arms, weeping. Lan stared at them all, and it was only Kalira who snapped him out of his trance.
"Drape the blankets over all of them and get some more wood,"
his companion said harshly, then actually walked over to her sire and bit him on the neck. Satyran's sagging head flew up. Lan didn't hear what went on between them, but he didn't wait to see anything more. Draping blankets over the sobbing women and over Paul, he escaped to the forest again, and a job he could understand. He went back and back again until he was stumbling through the dusk that obscured everything in his path and was forced to give up. By then, Ilya was sleeping and Eleanor organizing a crude camp. The three companions arranged themselves in 3 sides of a square around the blankets spread on the snow, lying down. Paul lay still unconscious, with his eyes bandaged and his head pillowed on Satyran's flank, between Ilya and Kalira. The fire formed the 4th side of the square. Tuck wearily ate a handful of bread, and Eleanor looked up at Lan's entrance.
"Get some sleep,"
she said shortly, her voice nasal and thick with weeping.
"If we can, we'll have to leave in the morning. We've no food and no shelter. We can't stay here."
Lan didn't say anything. Guilt devoured him and killed any appetite he might have had. He lay down obediently and turned his face away from Eleanor, sure that he wasn't going to get a wink of sleep all night. And he was right. He stared at Dassery's flank and the firelight flickering on it for candle marks, stomach knotted with misery while the stars wheeled overhead. He heard Tuck lie down and eventually begin breathing deeply. He heard Eleanor gently fall over sideways. When he looked, she was asleep, half propped by Tuck's body, up against Satyran's shoulder. He sat up. "I'll take care of the fire," he told Satyran, mind-speaking so as not to make a sound. Satyran nodded, ever so slightly, but did not reply. Lan found some relief from his guilt by making certain the fire burned evenly and without smoke, feeding it diligently as the stars paraded overhead.
As dawn neared, he felt a tap on his shoulder.
"I'll take over now,"
Tuck said, giving him an understanding smile. He nodded, finally so dull with exhaustion he couldn't feel anything. He curled up against Dassary's shoulder and knew nothing more. He woke to hear Paul's voice.
"All right," he said as Lan started up, turning in his mentor's direction.
Paul's head pointed toward Lan, and he managed a weak smile.
"Lan, thank you."
"For what?" Lan responded harshly, scooting over to sit on his heels beside his mentor. The warmth of the fire bathed them both, and at least this fire smelled of wood smoke and pine and not of burned flesh.
"That will be enough of that,"
Ilya snapped, swiveling her head to glare at him.
"What's better, blinded or half-burned? If you'd gotten the bastard before Paul started to get loose, would Paul have ended up cooking with him? What happened is done, and we're alive, and it could have been much worse."
Lan trembled anyway. The guilt was there. He couldn't exactly wish it out of existence. He knew that if he had just not hesitated,
"It won't happen that way again."
Paul patted Ilya's hand.
"He's done you a favor, my love,"
the senior herald said, with an attempt at a laugh.
"They're hardly going to allow me on a battlefield now."
Eleanor choked on a sob, and he hugged her with his free arm.
"The tempest ruined the orchard, but applewood makes a sweet fire,"
Tuck quoted under his breath.
"Exactly," Paul replied.
Ilya's stare went right through Lan, as if she was daring him to display any more guilty feelings.
"Rest,"
she told Paul.
"This is just temporary. I will heal you."
But Paul said nothing, and Lan got a peculiar and gut-twisting feeling that Paul was far from confident that she would be able to do that, and was humoring her with his silence.
"Oh, gods, what have I done?"
Lan was happy to escape into the woods for yet more wood, although he couldn't outrun his guilt. By late afternoon, Paul was strong enough to drink something hot, and was insisting that he could and must ride.
"No,"
Ilya replied, although weakly. He was wearing her arguments down.
"Yes," he insisted. "I've ridden with worse wounds than this."
He did sound stronger, although there was still an edge of pain in his voice.
"And you were 20 years younger at the time,"
she responded waspishly, trying to cover up the fact that she was weeping again. He shrugged and sat up slowly.
"I don't think I've lost too much blood, thanks to your quick work. We can't stay here. Where there was one assassin, there may be more. We haven't any more food and no shelter, and I can see well enough through Satiran's eyes."
"How is that going to help?"
Ilya asked.
"I can see to ride," was all he said. "Help me up."
To Lan's astonishment, with Ilya and Eleanor on either side of him, he got slowly to his knees. Satiran went to him immediately and knelt down beside him. With great effort and Ilya's help, he mounted. Ilya unpacked the straps meant to hold a wounded and unconscious herald in the saddle, and strapped him in. Satiran lurched to his feet, hindquarters coming up first, then forequarters, as Paul controlled his swift intake of breath, producing the slightest hiss of pain. He stayed quietly in his saddle for a long time, as Satiran swung his head about.
"Yes, this will be fine, I think. Ilya, come up behind me. I might need a little help with managing the pain."
"How can he do this?"
Lan wondered.
"He's blind. Shouldn't he be crying or screaming or something?"
As another stab of self-recrimination lanced through Lan, the bandaged head swung accurately to point in Lan's direction.
"Before you start in on berating yourself and deciding that you are the only one to blame for this, Satiran says to inform you that you have to take second place to him. Paul told him, then offered a hand to his wife. She refused it. Instead, she motioned to Tuck, who made a stirrup of his hands for her. She grabbed the high cantle of the saddle, stood in Tuck's hand, and swung her free leg over Satyron's rump up onto the pillion to ride astride, one arm carefully around her husband, the other gripping the cantle for her real support. Lan and Tuck cleaned up the hasty camp, extinguished the fire, and gathered up their belongings, stuffing them any way they would fit into the saddlebags and strapping them all on the pillion pad of Tuck's saddle. Eleanor chose to ride behind Lan, who was very much of a mixed mind about that. But he wasn't about to voice an objection. He didn't exactly have a right to. Her arms closed around his waist, and she kept sniffling in his ear.
"We're legs from the battlefield. How did the Carsite get here?" Tuck said aloud. "How did he pass the lines?"
Ilya was the first to respond, and though her voice sounded controlled, Lan could see she was still white and tight-lipped.
Why drop down on us as if he was waiting for us? What was he shouting?
"Death to demons or something like that," Tuck supplied. "He couldn't have been waiting for us, could he?"
Paul put one hand on the saddle pommel. "Let's hold a moment. We need to let others know what happened to us, so it doesn't happen to anyone else. Satyron." The other two companions moved forward to touch their noses to Satyron's, while Lan averted his eyes so he wouldn't have to look at Paul's face or into Ilya's swollen, bloodshot eyes.
"I will never hesitate again."
Beneath him, Kalira tensed with the effort of mind-speaking. This was no ordinary mind-speech. The three companions had joined efforts so that Satyron could warn every other companion within range of what had just happened, and they would, in turn, warn others. It didn't take long. A few heartbeats, and Kalira relaxed again, then backed up, shaking her head and snorting. Only Paul and Satyron remained still a moment longer, and when Satyron moved, there were no signs of him in relaxation.
"Lan,"
Kalira said, tensing beneath him.
"There's trouble."
"We have troubles ahead," Paul said tensely, as Ilya responded to the words by wrapping her arm tightly around his chest and taking the reins from him with her right hand. "We have to get to the pass. Now."
"You can't,"
Ilya protested weakly. "Satyron can gallop and still keep me in the saddle," Paul replied, though it was clear that he spoke through pain. "We don't have a choice." Ilya closed her mouth on further protests, just holding Paul tighter than before, as if she did not have as much confidence in Satyron's ability as he did. Satyron moved into a gallop in a couple of strides, with Tuck and Dassery behind him. Kalira waited until Eleanor was secure before doing the same. The headlong pace down the gloomy road left no time for thought, much less guilt, for Lan had all he could do to keep himself down over Kalira's neck and balanced, since he had to compensate for Eleanor. And it was at a gallop that they pounded into the army encampment, a candle mark before sunset. Paul wanted nothing so much as to lie down. His head throbbed, the gash across his eyes felt like a burning brand, and he wanted so badly just to have the leisure to mourn his loss. But not now. There was duty, and there was duty, and Lan was desperately needed. If Lan was needed, so was Paul.
"I don't care,"
Ilya protested behind him as someone helped her down out of his saddle.
"I don't care how much you need him. You get him a stretcher, and you take him there lying down, and I tell you when he's spoken enough."
Paul wanted to protest, but he couldn't. How could he? He could barely sit astride his companion, even with the help of all the straps. He let himself be taken down out of the saddle and assisted onto the stretcher, and as his head touched the pillow there, he felt tears of relief seeping into the bandage around his eyes. They carried him into the Lord Marshal's tent. Now Lan was Paul's eyes. All that time that they had spent linked so that Paul could show him the intricacies of his own gift was serving a dual purpose. Ilya allowed him to sit up, but only with the aid of several pillows and folded blankets. They sat in the tent of the Lord Marshal himself. The Lord Marshal's herald watched them solemnly with an unidentifiable expression on his young face. This herald Turag was a replacement. The Lord Marshal's original herald Marek had been one of the first casualties of the stand at White Foal Pass. Not dead, but so seriously wounded that he would be months in recovering and probably lose a leg.
"These new sun priests, we call them the Dark Servants, turned up a few days ago. They start in on their business at sunset, and these things howl around the tents all night long. Come morning, people are dead in their bedrolls, and the morale of our troops is being hammered,"
the Lord Marshal said. The man looked very much as if his own morale was in jeopardy. There were huge circles beneath his eyes, and new lines of strain in his face. His thick, gray hair, tied back from his face in a utilitarian tail, was lank and brittle, and his beard hadn't been trimmed or properly cared for in a fortnight.
"We're outnumbered, but more to the point, we're at a profound disadvantage,"
Lord Marshal Weldon continued.
"How can we fight something we can't see? It strikes in the dark, and no one is safe. They've pushed us back every day, and every night we lose more men to their horrors. One more day, and they're going to break through, and they won't stop until they reach Haven."
Lan clenched his jaw, and Paul felt it, but the boy was hiding his innermost thoughts.
"Are they out there now, the Dark Servants?" Lan asked. "Can we see them from our lines?"
"They make damned certain we can," the Lord Marshal said bitterly. "You can see them and their cursed bonfires from here with no difficulty at all. We've tried shooting at them, but they're just out of range, and no one wants to get any closer."
Paul was suddenly left without eyes. Lan cut off his link.
"Please, my lord, I need to see them for myself," the boy said,
then just got up, brushed through the tent flaps, and was gone. Paul didn't need to see to know that the Lord Marshal was nonplussed at this very junior herald's abrupt departure.
"My lord, I think we had better follow him,"
he said, as the new Marshal's herald stepped attentively to his side and touched his elbow.
"No,"
Ilya said.
"Yes,"
Paul ordered through clenched teeth. The stretcher-bearers took Paul outside, following the Marshal, and they all went out into the open air. Once outside, Paul found Satyron gently shoving the young herald aside with his nose and taking the latter's place. Now he saw what Satyron saw, which was taking some getting used to, since there was a peculiar blind spot straight ahead, but an enormous amount of peripheral vision. One eye saw Paul, while the other surveyed everything on the opposite side. The Lord Marshal's tent stood on the top of a hill overlooking White Foal Pass, where the army of the Carsites spread out beneath them, an ugly blot upon the white snow. Although it was nearly dark, there was enough light to show more than Paul wanted to see. Bonfires blazed along the front of that blotch, 7 of them in all, and Paul saw why the Lord Marshal had called the bonfires cursed. At the heart of each was a stake, and tied to the stake was what was left of a man. Beside each fire was a person in long, hooded robes. Encircling the fires at a healthy distance were other folk in the robes that Paul recognized as being the sun priests he was familiar with. Despite the distance, the clear air of these mountains made it easy to make out what was there, and Satyron's eyes were exceptionally keen. Lan peered down at the bonfires, one hand on Kalira's shoulder, standing as still as one of the trees beyond him.
"It's when the fires burn down to coals that the things start howling. The victims in the fires are no one of ours, none from the army, that is," the Lord Marshal growled. We try and retrieve the bodies of our own before they can get to them, and we've seen them dragging ruffians in Karsite rags to the fires and trussing them to the stakes. I'm assuming that the victims are brigands or thieves.
Or just some poor fellows who were in the wrong place, Paul replied. Whatever they are, I doubt they deserved. The fires below them suddenly erupted. Once again, Paul heard that strange sound, as of something soft and heavy hitting the ground. It wasn't like thunder, nor like a tree falling, though it had something of the character of both these sounds. Now, though, he realized what it was, what the cause was, anyway. Lan had called the fires, and they had answered. Between one heartbeat and the next, the bonfires grew. No, grew was too mild a word for the way they increased exponentially in size and fury. They burst outward in all directions, and they ate the priests around them before the latter could even twitch, licking out, enveloping them, and devouring them before the eyes of their followers. The newly roused fires roared, their voice like a chorus of wild beasts, so loud that if there was any screaming going on down there, and there must be, it was completely drowned. In the next instant, the fires merged into one, a line cutting across the pass, effectively separating the Karsites from Valdemar. Not a chorus of beasts now, the single fire roared in a solitary voice of triumph. And as it roared, it began to move, spreading toward the Karsite tents. Paul and Satyron stared, mesmerized. Probably everyone in the Valdemaran lines was doing the same at that moment. For the moment he forgot his pain, forgot he was tired unto death, forgot everything but the fire in front of him. The flames clawed at the sky, reaching higher than the treetops, high as the mountain peaks on either side of the pass. Little vortices twisted in the midst of the flames, dancing along the burning ground delicately, gracefully. The fire drove forward, chasing the Karsites out of their encampment, driving them back to their own border. Paul felt the heat of it scorching his face even from his stretcher. He couldn't imagine what it was like down in the pass. Showers of sparks, storms of sparks, spun through the sky above the flames, yet none of them landed on the Valdemar side of the fire line. Choking, black smoke billowed above the fire, yet none of it blew across to fill the lungs of Valdemarans.
"What are our people doing?"
Paul asked Satyron, for nothing could be seen of the Karsite side but flame. Satyron turned his head, and just below them ranged a sea of faces, all staring at the firestorm incredulously, mesmerized by the power and the awful beauty. No one moved, and if anyone spoke or even shouted, it couldn't be heard above the roar of the fire. Trees actually exploded from the heat, burning pieces flying in every direction except toward the Valdemaran forces. The fire crawled slowly away, and where it had been, there was only bare earth and the smoldering remains of stumps. It retreated up the pass, presumably sending the Karsites fleeing before it.
"What's Lan doing?"
Paul prompted. Satyron swung his head about, obedient to Paul's wishes. Satyron couldn't see Lan's face from this angle, but the boy was no longer standing rock-steady. He swayed a little, and so did Kalira. That wasn't what made the hair on the back of Paul's neck stand up, though. What he saw was chilling, and was probably sending a finger of fear down the spine of everyone else who could see the boy. Tiny blossoms of flame danced around Lan, flickering in his hair, floating in the air above him, twirling on his fingertips, and the tiny fires swayed to the same directions as the greater fires.
Blessed gods!
If there was anyone who hadn't known of Lan's powers before, they certainly were in no doubt of them now. Lan's hand spasmed in Kalira's mane. The flamelets vanished. The boy collapsed, his knees giving out beneath him. He slid down Kalira's side to land in a crumpled heap on the snow, and the firestorm below faltered. As quickly as it had begun, it died, until there was nothing in the pass but burning tree stumps, glowing coals, and blackened ground. No one moved for a long time. Although normally this would have been an occasion for cheers, the sheer and terrifying power of the fire had left mouths dry with unspoken fear, and no one dared to approach the creator of that terror. No one, except Eleanor, who shook off her mother's hand and ran to Lan's side. Kalira first knelt, then carefully laid herself down beside her chosen, and Eleanor propped Lan's head up against her flank as Paul finally broke his own paralysis and sent his litter-bearers stumbling toward them, with Satyron right behind him.
"He's just exhausted,"
Eleanor said, looking up at her father with relief.
"He needs to be put to bed, though, and he'll need to eat like a starving man when he wakes."
Paul didn't doubt that in the least, and fortunately the young herald Turag was near enough to hear her. Without being asked to, he moved to Eleanor's side, carefully scooped the boy up in his arms, and carried him off, Eleanor running alongside. Kalira remained where she was. She was probably just as exhausted as Lan was.
"Turag's Adan will stay with her,"
Satyron said, moving in Herald Turag's wake. Paul went with him, lying flat and exhausted on the stretcher himself, one hand still on Satyron's shoulder. They caught up with the Lord Marshal's herald just as he shoved his way through the entrance of a tent. "He can have my bed for now," Turag told Eleanor as Paul reached for the tent flap and held it open so Satyron could see inside by the light of the lamp that burned beneath the center pole. There were several cots set up, heaped with blankets. From the clothing scattered about, this tent was shared by several heralds. Turag put Lan down on one of the cots, and Eleanor carefully covered him over, taking a cushion from nearby and settling herself on the floor beside him. Turag backed away, then turned and motioned to Paul's litter-bearers to bring him inside as well. With Satyron outside, there was no room for him in the crowded tent. Paul was left in darkness again. They transferred him to another cot as Turag hovered nearby. "What happened?" the young man asked Paul anxiously. "Did that boy,
The boy is Harold Lavan Firestarter, and yes, he caused all that."
Paul waved his arm in the general direction of the pass.
"Mind you, his strength comes from anger, and if we hadn't been attacked today, I don't know that he could have."
His voice trailed off, and he shrugged as Turag took in the blood-stains on his whites. "I forgot. You were the ones that were ambushed. I suppose that would give him enough anger for anything," Turag replied, his mind clearly more on Lan and the firestorm than anything else. "I'm not really suited for this position. He seemed to suddenly wake up and looked sharply at Paul. "Sir, would you be willing to put off your rest for a little longer? I think the Lord Marshal will want an explanation."
"Ah, gods, not more."
He wanted so badly to sink down into the blackness of sleep rather than the blackness of sightlessness.
"All right," he began.
"A handful of words,"
Ilya said angrily.
"and no more."
The Lord Marshal did indeed want an explanation. The Lord Marshal also wanted a great deal of assurance that Lan was no danger to their own people. Finally, even Paul's patience and strength were exhausted, and Ilya's was already strained to the breaking point.
"My lord,"
he snapped, his head pounding and his eyes one long streak of agony.
"Enough!"
Ilya took this as her cue to speak the words that had probably been trembling behind her lips for the past candle-mark. There was no mistaking the anger in her voice. She couldn't revenge herself on the man that had attacked him, but she could and would vent some spleen on the Lord Marshal.
"With all due respect, my lord, you know the king's position on this boy already. And my husband is tired, wounded, and should have been in a bed the moment we entered this camp. If you must have reassurance, seek it somewhere else."
Paul knew that tone of voice, and pictured her in his mind without any difficulty, her eyes flashing, her head up, quite ready to do battle with the king himself at this moment. The Lord Marshal was no match for her in this mood. Thank the gods. Paul didn't think he could have stayed there for another moment, and he didn't have to. With stammered apologies, the Lord Marshal sent for servants, who bustled about the tent, fetching food, drink, and a fresh brazier, emptying the tent of all the cots but the ones Lan and Paul were on, and a third one left for Tuck, who was already asleep on it. Paul got cool cider to drink in short order, and a blanket warmed over the brazier, pain medicine, and a piece of bread with cheese melted over it, along with a snow pack laid gently across his eyes to ease the burning. When the drug in his drink eased the pain as well, then summoned him down into slumber, he went, willingly, with his hand clasped in his beloved Ilia's to give him comfort. "22. Sometime during the ride to the headquarters, Paul had made up his mind on several points. It had given him relief from the pain to work things logically through in that way. Losing his eyesight was not going to be a tragedy, and if Ilia could not heal him, then he would simply accept that. The events of the evening only confirmed that belief. He worked through everything as logically as he could during the ride, and during that night and the day and night that followed, in his dreams he was able to employ a technique called directed dreaming to work through things emotionally. It wasn't easy. He exhausted himself all over again, weeping for what he had lost and raging against everyone involved, including himself. But it had to be done, and quickly, and dreams were the best and least harmful place to do so. As a consequence, when he woke, he actually felt remarkably normal. Ilia was not with him, but Satyron was, lying beside his cot on a thick layer of straw laid over the canvas floor of the tent. That was how Paul was able to see that Lan was still unconscious on the cot on the opposite side of the tent, with Kalira beside him, a charcoal brazier warming the air between the two companions, and everything else that had been in the tent with them except for a third cot was gone.
"The other heralds removed their things last night,"
Satyron informed him.
"They've moved into a different tent. Just as well. It would have been very crowded in here. Ilia has been with you most of the time, until the chief healer here came and chased her off to a bed around dawn."
A pile of uniforms lay stacked at the foot of the cot. Paul sat up stiffly, stripped off his blood-stained clothing, and gratefully donned a clean, new set of whites. The only things he retained were his boots. "Let's go find the Lord Marshal," he said aloud, standing up with care and one hand on the wall of the tent, moving to the side so that Satyron had a bit more room. "I have the feeling he needs more of that reassurance." Satyron got to his feet with an eye on the brazier. Once Paul had a secure hold of his mane, the two of them went out into the cold morning. The scent of stale smoke still hovered over the camp, and the blackened pass below was an ever-present reminder of what had so recently happened. Smoke still rose from the stumps of trees, giving the oddly disconcerting effect of dozens of black chimneys sticking up out of the earth, as if there was an entire village underground down there. There was no sign of the Carsites. Anything that had been in their camp was ashes, indistinguishable from the ashes of trees and bushes. The Carsites themselves were nowhere to be seen.
"Well, given what happened to them, would you come back here?"
Satyron asked reasonably. He raised his head and looked around alertly.
"I believe that the Lord Marshal is in the command tent, and as you suggested, still in need of a level head to point out that Lan is no danger to our side. The vista that lies below us did not give him much of a sense of comfort this morning.
I can't imagine why not."
Well, Satyron was back to normal at any rate. The two of them made their way to the command tent, and this time Satyron just poked his head inside without an invitation, decided there was enough room in there for him, and squeezed his considerable bulk along one side of the map table, much to the Lord Marshal's gape-mouthed surprise. "Sorry, my lord, but Satyron is necessary," Paul said apologetically, wedging himself in on the same side as his companion. Satyron seized a camp chair in his strong teeth and pulled it over to Paul, who felt it over, then sat down in it gratefully. Turag looked at both of them and then turned to the Lord Marshal. "My Lord Weldon," he said, "I would like to be put back on duty with the rest of the army." Paul was probably as surprised as the Lord Marshal himself. That venerable gentleman was taken entirely aback. "Hear me out," Turag continued earnestly. "My only gift is mind speech, which, I'll grant you, is very strong. But I have no battlefield experience, no leadership experience, and this is not the time or place to get them at the possible expense of making blunders. Harold Paul has both. You are known to each other, and even more important, he is the mentor of that, remarkable youngster, Harold Lavan. Please, I beg you, let me go back to a job I know how to do and put Harold Paul in my place." "Humph," coughed the Lord Marshal, fingering his beard and looking at Paul with speculation.
"I don't want you to think that you haven't been doing a good job."
"I know my own abilities and limitations, my lord," Turag replied. "I have been doing an adequate job. You need someone outstanding."
Meanwhile, Paul's spirits rose. The plain fact was that Turag was right. Even without the use of his own eyes, he would be just as good a marshal's herald as Marek had been. Not that he wouldn't be happy to hand Marek's job back to him as soon as he was fit again. But in the meantime—
"Paul, how do you feel about this?"
the Lord Marshal asked.
"I don't want you to think this is offered out of pity, because it isn't. You're good. You may not be the strongest mind speaker about, but you're strong enough, and your companion can make up for that. Being the youngster's mentor makes you doubly valuable to me."
Paul smiled wholeheartedly for the first time since he had lost his eyesight. "My lord, I would be pleased and honored to accept. Harold Turag, I am and will be forever grateful for your generous offer and great soul."
Turag heaved a sigh of relief. "You're the generous one, Harold Paul," the young man replied, "and I'm the one who is grateful. Now, if you don't mind, I'll excuse myself, and Adden and we will take ourselves back to the unit we came from."
Turag lost no time in making himself scarce, which left Paul and the Lord Marshal alone for a moment or two, until the next crisis came on.
"How's the boy?"
the old man asked, betraying just a hint of his unease. "Still recovering. Last night's exhibition was well out of his normal abilities." Paul felt the edge of the table and pulled himself closer to it. "I hope you aren't planning on more of the same, because I'll be honest with you, I don't think he can do that sort of thing very often."
"Ah."
That seemed to be exactly what the Lord Marshal needed to hear.
"On the other hand, the Carsites don't know that, do they?"
"So any time fires start," Paul allowed himself a cruel chuckle. "I can't say that seeing them run like frightened mice is going to make me unhappy. Well, let me tell you what Lan can do on a regular basis." Briefly, he outlined what Lan had been practicing, and the Lord Marshal nodded as he listened.
"We can extract a great deal of tactical advantage from having him, not to mention that he can rid us of that nocturnal enemy that gave the Carsites an advantage over us. How long do you think he'll need to recover? We can hold camp here for another day or so, if that's all it will take."
"Kalira thinks he'll be up and able by tomorrow morning,"
Satyron reported. "That should be long enough," Paul replied.
"Excellent.
The Lord Marshal rubbed his hands together and flexed his fingers.
"Now, come over here and have a look at this troop disposition."
It was Satyron who craned his neck over the map table as the Lord Marshal pushed tokens about, but it was obvious that this made no difference to the leader of Valdemar's armies. Paul bent over the table, holding his head up in both hands, suggesting possible strategies, and felt whole once again. Lan woke slowly. Eleanor wasn't sitting there next to him, but Tuck was, and he was just as pleased with that substitution. It was easy enough to tell the difference, even with his eyes closed. Tuck didn't hover over him.
I guess healers think they have to loom over their patients all the time.
When he finally stretched and opened his eyes, he discovered that there were only 3 cots set up in the tent, which he recalled as holding more than that.
"Hey,"
Tuck said cheerfully.
"you're finally awake? Wait until you see what you did the other night out there in the pass. It's pretty impressive."
Lan wasn't all that sure that impressive was the proper word for it.
I, just did what I could to get rid of those things the Lord Marshal was afraid of. I thought, if I got rid of those dark servant priests and chased the rest away, that would be a good thing.
He really didn't know what else to say at that point.
"And believe me, the entire camp is grateful. 2 entire nights without bogles howling around the camp and people dying in their sleep, and 2 days without fighting,"
Tuck replied and threw him a clean uniform from a stack at the foot of the cot.
"Lord Marshal wants to see you as soon as you've got something to eat. Can't just rest on your laurels, More things to do if we're going to scare those beasts back across the border for good and all."
Tuck's solid, ordinary matter-of-factness was the best tonic Lan could have had. He scrambled out from under his warm blankets and into the chill air, stripping off his old uniform and putting on a new one.
"I thought there were more people in this tent,"
he said as he pulled on his boots.
"There were, but Paul and I chased them out,"
Tuck said.
"Just you, me and him, and Kalira and Satyron. No more room in the tent for anyone else. He's the Lord Marshal's herald now, Paul is, so how is that for a promotion? Lord Marshal says he's seeing more using Satyron's eyes than any 4 people using their own."
Lan's throat closed in a spasm. He swallowed hard to clear it. No matter what he did, he'd never be able to undo what had happened to Paul. And he recalled only too vividly a scene that had played out in the tent before Tuck had come to replace Eleanor.
"I can't do it,"
Ilya had wept quietly, hopelessly.
"I've tried everything I know, and I can't. I can't heal him, and I never will. He's going to be blind for the rest of his life, and it's my fault." "No, it isn't," he'd wanted to shout. "It's my fault. All mine, and I'm so sorry." "Mother, you can't do it all at once,"
Eleanor had soothed, taking her mother away. He hadn't heard anything after that, for they had been outside the tent, but he had turned his face to the wall and wept into his pillow, crying himself to sleep with the pain of his own guilt.
"Anyway,"
Tuck continued, blithely oblivious,
"Elia isn't arguing. If the promotion sticks, Paul will never have to leave the Collegium again, and she says she'll stick to teaching."
"That would be nice for them,"
Lan managed to say, without sounding like he was about to cry.
"Where's the food?"
Guilt-ridden or not, his stomach was oblivious to his emotions and wanted tending. Tuck laughed and gave him a hand up, then led the way to the mess tent. The army was spread out over the expanse of several hillsides, but there were several mess tents, it seemed, and the nearest was not that far from their own camp. It wasn't a very large tent, and served mostly, it seemed, to keep the snow and wind out of the cook fires. Army rations weren't the most elaborate in the world. Lan got a bowl of grain porridge from a big kettle and considered himself fortunate to have that. It was sticky and full of lumps, but it was food, and there was enough honey to make it taste all right. Outside the tent, logs had been set up along the hillside to make rough seats, so that was where he and Tuck took themselves. Tuck had decided in favor of skipping a second breakfast. Lan polished off the bowl, ignoring the whispers as some of the fighters recognized him. It made him feel even more awkward and unhappy as some of them left their meals and scuttled off, though.
Joyous. I get rid of the Karsite monsters, but now I'm a monster.
Tuck kept up a bright stream of chatter, and Lan shoveled in his food, forcing it past the lump in his throat. More people crammed into the area outside the tent, staring at him and whispering, and he ate faster.
Let's get out of here,
he whispered to Tuck as he shoved the last bite into his mouth.
Sure,
Tuck agreed, and they stood up to leave, only to find that the crowd near the tent was the merest hint of the one on the opposite side of it. Lan backed up a pace. Feeling cold and queasy, he stared back into all those strange faces, wondering what they wanted. Were they only curious, or were they as afraid of him as his own parents were? They pressed in around him, separating him from Tuck, surrounding him on all sides. He couldn't see any officers, much less other heralds.
What do they want?
Where was Kalira? Had they bound her up somewhere so they could deal with him without her interference? He straightened up and faced them squarely. There was a whisper of voices from farther out in the group, but those nearest him didn't seem hostile. The chant started in the rear of the crowd, a few voices at first, and for a few doubtful moments he couldn't tell what they were saying. Then it became clear.
Firestorm! Firestorm! Firestorm!
More voices took up the chant.
Firestorm! Firestorm! Firestorm!
Now they were all shouting it, and the crowd surged forward, seizing Lan and hoisting him up onto their shoulders. When they grabbed him, he very nearly passed out. But the huge grins and enthusiasm quickly persuaded him that they meant no harm, and when he realized that they meant to thank him by parading him around the entire camp, the excitement made it very hard to breathe. More and more people joined in as Lan's bearers trotted him through the lines of tents, swelling the chanting chorus until he couldn't hear anything else. Up and down the hills, even out to the sentries and back, running now, so that he hung on to the shoulders of two of his supporters for dear life. They finally marched up the hill with him, heading toward the command tent where the Lord Marshal and his generals were standing, with Paul and Satyron beside them. For the first time he wondered what the Lord Marshal would have to say about this demonstration. To Lan's relief, the Lord Marshal had a smile on his face. He didn't look at all angry about it.
Well, you are the hero of the Battle of Whitefall Pass,
Kalira said, poking her head over her sire's shoulder.
Be properly gracious now.
Lan's supporters deposited him in front of the Lord Marshal, and finally the chanting died away. The old man took Lan's shoulders in both his hands and turned him around to face the crowd. This was very like being on that high platform in the city square, and very unlike, for these were all people who had no doubts about him. All the smiling faces peering up at him, spreading out in a human carpet down the hillside, made him feel so wonderful he could hardly stand still.
Fighters of Valdemar!
The Lord Marshal declaimed, his voice carrying easily to the farthest man.
Here is the partner that you have so desperately needed to drive the Karsites back to their own land. While you conquer their armies, here is the gallant herald who will see to it that their foul demons and insidious trickery can do you no harm, that their vile monsters are sent flying back into the faces of those who would use them against you. I give you Herald Lavan Firestorm!"
Dizzy with exhilaration, Lan thought the cheering would never end. Lan bent over the map table with the others, intent on the reports of scouts and heralds with farsight, although he hardly felt as if he belonged there. After all, what was he doing, the youngest herald in the circle, in company with the Lord Marshal and all the commanders of the army? No one else even gave him a second glance, though,
so he held his tongue and tried to concentrate on the reports like everyone else. There were charcoal braziers going in all four corners of the tent, and the flap was shut tight, but it was still cold in here. The white canvas moved in the wind, belling inward and outward again. The Lord Marshal's cot and chests were pushed back against the rear of the tent, giving everyone room to stand around the map table. Everyone except Paul, that is, whose continued weakness left him sitting while the rest stood.
"The main force of the Karsite army appears to be here," Harold Fedor said, marking a rough oblong on the map on the far side of Whitefall Pass with his finger. "Right at the moment, they don't seem too keen on trying the pass a second time. I haven't seen any more of those new priests of theirs."
"That doesn't mean that they aren't there, however,"
the Lord Marshal rumbled, though he did look fairly satisfied with the current situation.
"Best guess from the foreseers
is that they'll move eastward along here," Fedor replied, tracing a path along the back of the mountain ridge divided by the pass. "You can see that there's a small river running along here, enough to cut a long valley without too many obstacles, and there's something of a roadway beside it. It's not the easiest place to take a major force, but it's the best they're going to get. That's what the two with foresight think."
"I wish it was what they knew, but beggars can't be choosy about what they get," Commander Rayleigh said. "Well, look at this. If they come along this route here, can they come through at us here?" His finger stabbed down at a minor pass, one that came out in a heavily wooded area on the Valdemar side, marked only as Pine Forest. Lan noted thankfully that there didn't seem to be any major habitations there, not so much as a village. All eyes went to the chief scout, who pulled at his lip, then nodded.
"It does go through to their route, if that's the one they take, and it's wide enough at that point to bring them through in numbers. Odds are they aren't going to give up, not at this point. For all they know, it was their own priests that did something wrong and not something we did."
The Lord Marshal grimaced.
"And they can make better time than we can to get to that pass. Their route is shorter, with fewer obstacles in the way. Damn. Well, pass the word. We'll march in 2 candle marks. Are we dealing with anything between here and there?"
"Some pockets here, and here,"
the scout pointed.
"Maybe more. We'll find them before they know where we are."
He sounded confident, and Lan knew that he should be. The Valdemaran scouts had yet to be detected by the Karsites, and brought far more information than the couple of Farseers, who had to concentrate on areas they already knew were worth spying on.
"Young Lavan,"
the Lord Marshal said, turning to him, somewhat to his surprise.
"I want you to work with Fedor and Scout Callum here while we're on the march. You're going to be our catapult, our way of getting at someone entrenched. If any of those pockets of Karsite forces are well entrenched, I'd rather deal with them at a distance than winkle them out like snakes in a crevice."
Lan saluted the Lord Marshal, as he had seen other heralds do, with a quick snap to attention and a nod. "Yes, my lord," he replied simply. "I'll need Harold Tuck as well. I can't mind speak while I'm, working."
"Take him,"
the Lord Marshal replied simply, and waved Lan, the other herald, and the chief scout off, as he and his commanders got back to detailed battle plans. Lan didn't at all mind being dismissed. He followed Fedor and Callum out of the tent and into the sunlight. Fedor took his elbow and pointed at a companion near to a tent on the upward slope of the next hill.
"We're over there. Make sure there's someone assigned to handle your tent and supplies, then meet us there, and bring the other boy as well."
"Yes, sir," Lan replied, and the scout and herald hurried away. Already the camp was a sea of activity as tents were broken down and supplies packed up. He ran to the tent he shared with Paul and Tuck. Word had already been passed, and the Lord Marshal's own chief servant was at the tent, with a couple of other servants packing things up for them.
Paul and Satyron were with the commanders, of course, but Tuck and the other two companions watched the packing with interest.
"Hey, Tuck,"
Lan called, waving as he ran towards them.
"We've got an assignment."
Tuck's face brightened and he jumped up into his companion's saddle. Kalira cantered down the hill toward Lan, who mounted on the run. He was secretly pleased to be able to accomplish the maneuver, especially in front of an audience.
"With a little help from me, of course."
"Of course,"
he acknowledged, as Kalira paused just long enough for Tuck to catch up. Then they loped through the encampment, which now seethed with activity, heading for the scout camp. Fedor and Callum and the rest of the scouts who were not currently out on patrol waited for them there, at the edge of the main encampment, supervising the final pack-up of their own belongings, such as they were. Scouts tended to pack lightly. The scout contingent was a very mixed bag. There was Callum, who looked like most of the career fighters in the Guard or Army, and a couple more men and women like him, but the majority were nothing at all like professional soldiers. The youngest was no older than Lan, a dim-looking, shaggy-haired youth, mounted bareback on a pony that was just as shaggy, whose main article of clothing was a rough-sewn coat of sheepskin and hat and boots to match. The oldest was a stick, scrawny graybeard, whose horse could have been plucked from the king's stable just before a parade, and whose costume seemed to consist of odds and ends he'd picked up over the course of his lifetime. The rest of the group was just as eclectic, and included a young woman who kept close to the old man and was obviously highborn, a male and female pair of hunters, or at least that was what Lan guessed their profession had been, a couple of farmers, and 5 people who were clearly civilians, or former civilians, but whose former professions weren't immediately obvious. Callum didn't bother to introduce anyone. He just fired off some orders, and roughly half of the scouts mounted up and vanished over the next hill. The rest formed up into a rough group behind him, and with Harold Fedor followed him over the hill at a slower pace. Tuck and Lan, with Lan leading, worked their way through to Callum's right, since Fedor was already on his left.
"Do you have anything in mind for me, sir?"
Lan asked diffidently.
"We're going to wait at the outermost picket for the army to get marching,"
Callum replied, with an amused quirk of his lips, perhaps at Lan's diffidence.
"Then this lot will spread out and work the leading edge of the march. You heralds will stick with me until someone comes back with word, either of a pocket of trouble we already know about, or something we don't. I'll decide if it requires the, catapult solution. If it does," he pointed a finger at Lan, "you and your friend there will go with the scout to deal with it."
That seemed simple enough, and Lan nodded.
"I hope you've got an arrow in your quiver that's a bit more subtle than what you did at the pass," Callum continued. "We won't need to burn down the forest. In fact, the people who live here wouldn't appreciate that."
"I do, sir, I do,"
Lan hastened to say.
I've never done anything like that before. Kalira and I didn't know we could."
If the last words came out in a faltering tone, Callum didn't comment on it.
"Good. That's a relief. Yo, Ben, Dira, come over here and tell the boys what they're likely to be up against, will you?"
Callum waved at the old man and the young woman with the magnificent horses, who cut across a line of brush to take their places on either side of Lan and Tuck.
"I'm Dira Ashkevron, and this is Ben Dotes, our horsemaster,"
the young woman said.
"Retired, missy," the old man corrected. "Barnabin be every bit the horsemaster I ever was."
Dira smiled and continued.
"We volunteered, first thing. Brought a string of horses from the home farm and volunteered ourselves. We don't know this country, but we do know scouting and horses, so here we are."
Dira was not an attractive young woman. She had a face like an abused battle-axe, but her friendly and open personality made her face irrelevant. But it was Tuck who identified her, not Lan.
"Ashkevron?"
He gulped.
"The Ashkevrons? Of Forced Reach?" "Oh, my ears! That's the family that Harold Vaniel came from,"
Kalira exclaimed as the girl nodded.
We're all girls but my one brother, and he can't fight. He's laid up with a leg broke in 3 places.
Dira continued.
There's more of us coming, but I was the only one ready to go now. Fancied I'd go into the guard, and been training for it.
And I wasna about to let her go off alone, the old man added with a stubborn set to his mouth. But that's neither here nor there. We're to tell you about what we know, eh? So let's get to it.
Over the next league or so, the ill-matched pair detailed the 3 or 4 pockets of Karsite strength they thought would fall to land to eliminate. Rather as he had expected once they began, these places were all small fortresses, manned by no more than 20 or 30, that overlooked key passes. With that handful of fighters, the Karsites could easily delay the Valdemoran army by a day and perhaps more, if they had sun priests with them who could command similar powers to the heraldic gifts. The excitement of being called a hero had long since worn off, and when he realized that he would be expected to burn these people out, he began to feel queasy. Kalira sensed his unease, without knowing the cause, and enveloped him in a wordless blanket of assurance. There were hundreds, thousands of fighters in the army depending on him, who would, lose their lives if he didn't do what he was expected to do.
You'll be able to take care of them, won't you?
Dira asked anxiously.
If you can't, it would be bad. Very bad, I think.
I hesitated once. I swore I never would again. And I won't. I won't. When that didn't extinguish the queasiness, he called up the mental image of Paul with his bandaged eyes. Ilya beside him, with a reproachful look aimed straight toward him. That awoke guilt, but guilt was better than indecision. Just get me there, he told Dira. I'll do the rest. Since they would travel with the Lord Marshal and the bulk of the army, Paul and his family were left at loose ends until everyone was under way. There were servants to pack up the healer's gear, and the Lord Marshal's people dealt with Paul's. So Paul found himself with a rare moment of leisure to share with his wife. As they perched on a log with the last scrapings from the mess kettle to eat, nothing went to waste when a guard cook was in charge, and tried to stay out of the way. "What's wrong with Eleanor?" Paul whispered to Ilya to get her mind off her own failure to restore his sight, although he was afraid he already knew the answer. His daughter's listless behavior since Lan had awakened was something he would have called moping in anyone else. Most of her conversation was in monosyllables, and although he couldn't actually see her face, he suspected that her eyes were reddened from secret crying.
What do you think?
Ilya replied with a distinct edge to her voice.
Lavan woke up and didn't ask for her, didn't look for her, didn't even thank her. In fact, Lavan hasn't even looked at her since your accident.
Ah. Well, that was what he expected. Though it would have been better for poor Eleanor if her infatuation had turned to anger that Lan hadn't prevented the accident. And you, how do you feel about the boy?
I am mixed in feeling,
Ilya admitted.
It's not the boy's fault, but I am annoyed with him. I wish he'd at least notice she's in love with him. But he's so thick-headed.
Boys that age usually are, if they're unaffected by the girl in question, Paul said dryly. If they do notice, they're generally so embarrassed they try to avoid her altogether, and I can't see where that would be an improvement so far as Eleanor is concerned.
At least it would be rejection, and maybe she could stop trying to convince herself that if she just proves her devotion, he'll repay it.
Ilya responded, and took the empty bowl from him. There was more irritation in her voice now, and Paul guessed that she was more put out with her own daughter than with Lavan.
It's Eleanor I'm really irritated with,
she continued, confirming his guess.
How much will it take before she gives up? The boy couldn't be more indifferent to her, and she's a healer. She has to be able to sense his life bond with his companion by now.
Interestingly, Ilya's annoyance with her daughter lessened Paul's.
"She won't see it until she stops believing it isn't there,"
he told Ilya, and put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her a little closer. She resisted for a moment, then gave in and relaxed against him.
"She doesn't want to see it, and at her age, what you want seems more important sometimes than what is."
Gods,
Ilya groaned.
we may be dealing with this for years, then. Can't you do something?
"Lan doesn't need me now,"
Paul replied, after a moment of hesitation.
"Not after White Foal Pass. When this war is over and the Karsites are driven back, perhaps it would be wisest to have him stationed here permanently."
Even though he was thinking aloud, the idea caught hold of his imagination, and he could see how well it would work out. Eleanor would not be allowed to go far from the Collegium. Mind healers were too rare, and most people that needed them were brought to them rather than the other way around. And for Lan, this would be the ideal place. He could be left here on circuit for the next 2 years with a senior herald, then take over the circuit on his own. If the Karsites dared set foot across the border again, Lan would send them back with their tails smoking.
That would be perfect,
Ilya replied, seizing on his idea.
Separate them. She can't obsess about someone who forgets to even answer her letters.
"We can't do anything until the war is over,"
Paul cautioned her, as he sensed her relief and enthusiasm.
"A great many things could change between now and then."
I know.
"And during that time we're going to have to bear with her tears and tantrums,"
Paul continued,
"not to mention every other wretched thing that a war can throw at us."
But I can put out my hand and feel the candle, even if I can't light it yet,"
Ilya replied, sounding much less anxious already.
Just knowing it's there is enough.
Paul just nodded and tightened his arm. Sometimes knowing that there would eventually be an end to something was enough. Strange that Ilya could cope cheerfully with the endless flood of injured and dying, and be thrown so off balance by the mere heartache of their daughter.
And of her own inability to create a miracle.
I have to go. The healers should be packed up by now,
Ilya said abruptly.
I suppose.
"You know where to find me,"
Paul replied with a final squeeze before he let her go.
You go to your duty, love.
"And you to yours,"
he responded, and waited until the creak of her footsteps on the snow faded out of hearing range before summoning Satyron.
"Are we ready to join the Lord Marshal, old friend?"
he asked, as he felt his companion's warm breath on his neck.
Better ask if they are ready for us,
Satyron replied with a mental chuckle as he linked in with Paul and gave him sight again.
Let's ride.
23. Lan lay on a rocky overhang, peering down at his latest target, with the shepherd Wulaf beside him. Young Wulaf was a native of these parts. He and his shaggy pony could go very nearly anywhere that a goat could go. The boy was far more intelligent than he looked, and so was the pony. Lan and Tuck marveled at how much he knew about the area, and his pony's clever ability to find trails where there was no sign of where to go. Both pony and boy were, in the main, shaggy, untidy, brown. Both surveyed the world from beneath heavy forelocks of brown hair with blonde streaks bleached by the sun. So far, Lan had managed to eliminate 2 potential trouble spots without actually killing anyone. Both of the Karsite strongholds, positioned strategically above the route the army would have to travel, had been simple wooden fortresses thrown up out of local logs, and just starting a fire that the enemy couldn't put out had driven the Karsites into the open. He burned their fortresses to the ground once there was no longer anyone in them, to prevent the enemy from retaking and repairing the places.
Once they were no longer protected behind walls, the garrisons retreated back south and east without even putting up token resistance. This place, however, would prove a harder nut to crack. Below Lan, tucked into a flat space about halfway down the mountain, was what had begun its life as a robber baron's stronghold. Built stoutly of stone, kept even safer within high stone walls, it must have taken a very clever plan to capture it in the past. Subsequently, it had become a farm, mainly raising sheep, goats, and mountain ponies. Then the Karsites took it for themselves, and it became the platform from which they could prevent any passage through the pass below.
"Look yon,"
Olaf said, pointing at the largest building in the complex with a round, squat construction beside it.
"That war yon barn and silo, and reckon they bain't took out fodder and the like, nah?"
Huh. Hay burns,
Lan replied, shading his eyes to get a better view.
and their main gate is wood. I can take that out and leave them without a way to keep attackers out.
"Aye, that,"
Olaf agreed.
"Reckon ye burn all what bain't stone, they canna stay. Burn gate, food, bedding, clothes. Start wi' barn belike, and silo."
Lan narrowed his eyes, held tightly to the dragon's bonds with both mental hands, and allowed it to wake, a very little. He projected the power past the slate roof of the round, tower-like silo, sending a little spark into it to find tinder. He sensed it catch. Then the mountainside beneath him shook with a deafening roar. The mountain trembled. He and Olaf clung to their rocky perch and stared at each other. Olaf's pony locked his legs in place but screamed with fear, tossing his blunt head upward, his eyes wild beneath his shaggy, brindled forelock. Beneath them, a fountain of rock, dust, and snow blew out in an extravagant plume from the spot where the farm had been.
"Get cover!"
Olaf shouted, far quicker of wit than Lan. He and his pony scrambled back beneath the safety of the overhang, while Lan and Kalira followed, and just in time, as a rain of rocks, some half the size of the pony, plummeted down on the mountain top. For a few moments, all they could do was cower as boulders crashed all around them, chipping ice and rock from their protection, landing nearly at their feet. Every time one crashed near them, the rock under their feet vibrated. When the last pebble ticked down, a heavy silence descended. The haze of dust hanging over everything made Lan cough.
"What the deil happened?"
Olaf asked rhetorically and sneezed, his eyes as round and big as prize whortleberries.
I don't know,
Lan said, who had heard him only through a ringing noise in his ears. He made his way to the edge of the precipice on his hands and knees, testing each step before he took it, and looked down. The fortress was gone. Where it had been was a tumble of rock shaken down from the mountain above it, a tumble that continued down the side of the mountain and into the valley, seen imperfectly through a thick cloud of dust. Lan's jaw dropped. Olaf appeared beside him and whistled.
"Well, that being this the snakes we bain't to handle,"
Olaf said, with a studied air of disinterest. But Lan could only think that once again the dragon had feasted on blood, for no one in that fortress could have escaped. They found their way down the mountain with some difficulty. In many places the path was blocked by boulders or small landslides, and they had to backtrack to find another route. When they finally reached the scouts, however, they found that the mood was one of elation, and there was no question there about what had happened. They had already worked out what had caused the explosive eruption.
It was a farm, ye see,
Dira said as Lan and Olaf waited for someone to enlighten them.
You must have ignited the grain dust in the silo.
Lan's complete bafflement prompted more of an explanation.
The dust from the grain, powdered chaff, pulverized grain, bits of straw, can build up in a silo, and the silage at the bottom can ferment and give off fumes too. Sometimes farm workers drink the stuff to get drunk. Set a spark to that, if it's thick enough, and you get what you got.
Oh, was all that Lan could think of to say.
Were there any captives in there? Women? Children?
Probably not,
Dira replied dismissively.
and even if there were, all you did was set a spark to what would have gone off eventually anyway. Anyone poking around with a lamp, a candle, or a torch would have done the same, and they were obviously too ignorant to prevent it from happening.
Lan didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Kalira for comfort. He was doing that more and more as the days passed, going into a wordless communion with her whenever he was troubled. Somehow she managed to make him feel that his guilt was no greater than anyone else's, and that he must go on, for the greater good of everyone in Valdemar. He found reassurance in her that he could not extract from anyone or anything else, and a bond of love that was beyond anything he had ever dreamed of. It was not that she loved him unconditionally, it was that she knew the very worst of him and loved him despite that knowledge. One of the scouts rode back to tell the rest of the army that the way was clear. The rest of the scouts pitched camp where they were, for there could be no safer place to spend the night than one where they had cleared the enemy out beyond question. Lan went about his chores mechanically, most of his attention bound up in Kalira. Not surprisingly, he was in charge of the fire, and he and Tuck had the task of gathering wood and water. The scouts did not use tents, so a fire was all the more important to their camp. They camped rough, often supplementing their dried rations with game hunted as they moved. A wind sprang up above them and carried the dust away in a long, trailing plume, but nothing could hide the ugly scar down the mountainside. Lan was grateful for the evergreen trees, for their thickly needled branches hid that scar from him. When he brought back the first load of wood, he added it to what Tuck had brought and the others had gathered from around the campsite. He built a long fire rather than a typical pyramid. After all, he could keep anything he chose burning, and this way everyone would have a place right at the fireside to keep warm. With a careless flick of his mind, he set it burning. Green wood or windfall, dry or wet, it all burned at his touch, and burned totally, leaving behind only ashes and producing very little smoke. He went out into the scrubby forest time and time again, returning to the campsite with loads of wood or great enormous logs. Kalira helped there, dragging the logs in tied to her girth. He laid or rolled the logs down on his fire with Tuck's help, an advantage of having a long fire since it meant that no one had to chop the logs up to fit. Callum had charge of the primitive cooking by common consent, since he never ever burned anything. Tonight's catch was hare and squirrel, and very tasty it smelled, too, at the point when Lan was ready to stop hauling in wood. He accepted his rabbit hindquarter with a mug of strong tea and sat down beside Tuck to eat it. Stars bloomed overhead, and it seemed an impossible thing that this place could have been scarred by war only a few candle marks ago. Tuck poked him in the side as he sucked meditatively on a rabbit bone.
"What are you thinking?" he asked. "I can almost hear your thoughts jabbering to each other."
"Nothing much," Lan demurred. "Just that I don't know what they'll do with me when this war is over." Tuck snorted and punched Lan lightly on the upper arm.
"No fear of that any time soon. Did you hear the scout reports? This Carsite lot doesn't know when to give over."
"And we do," he countered with a dim smile. "But it's our land we're fighting on, so I suppose we can't give up."
"Suppose? You know we can't,"
Tuck exclaimed, giving him a peculiar look, as if he suspected his friend had gone mad. Lan didn't respond. He just dropped back into his link with Kalira, who came to stand behind him. "When is this going to end? And when it does, what will they do with me?" he asked her plaintively.
"I don't know for certain, but you mustn't fret about it, love,"
she replied.
"You will always be mated."
Something interrupted her. Her head went up and her eyes unfocused for just a moment. Across the fire, the same thing happened with Fedor's companion, and Tuck's Dassery as well. And that could only mean one thing. The situation had just changed again, and they were getting new orders. Kalira snapped out of her trance first.
"No rest for the weary, love,"
she said apologetically.
"Get the tack. We have to ride."
Lan had not been aware that the rest of the scouts were watching him, Tuck, and Fedor, but the moment he got up and reached for Kalira's saddle blanket,
The scouts started moving.
"Load and ride,"
Fedor said shortly, as he and his companion came back to themselves.
"The Carsites are moving faster than we thought they would.
Our job is to get Lan here to a point where he can hold them back until the rest of the army comes up."
Me? They're depending on me.
Although he had been told that something of the sort might happen, the words still put a chill down his back and a lump of cold fear in his stomach.
They are all expecting me to do what no one else can.
He froze for a moment, but no one else even paused in what they were doing. In fact, if anything, they put a bit more speed on. His fingers fumbled with the buckle on Kalira's girth until she enclosed him in a cocoon of calm. He couldn't help but feel comforted and steadied. His hands stopped shaking, and he finished his jobs just as quickly as the rest of the scouts. They all mounted within moments of each other.
"Kill the fire,"
Callum ordered, and Lan, who had discovered that he could extinguish fires as easily as he started them, obeyed. The flames shrank down to nothing in a heartbeat. The coals lingered a moment, then with a metallic clinking, went black. You could put your hand right into the middle of the ashen remains now and feel nothing more than a bit of residual warmth.
"Right,"
was all Callum said. He turned his horse's head up the trail and motioned to Fedor to take the lead. Companions had infinitely better night vision than horses. Fedor and his companion would find the trail and set the pace. The pace, in a moment, as Lan and Kalira swung into place behind Dira and in front of Ben, was going to be grueling, at least as far as the horses were concerned. It was a good thing that there was a full moon and that the snow reflected back so much moonlight. They alternated between a fast walk and a canter, holding the latter as long as the horses could bear up. Only when the first began to flag did they slow. Interestingly, the horse that failed first was generally Callum's mount, not the shaggy little pony that Wulaf rode.
"Where are we going?"
Lan asked, keeping himself low over Kalira's neck.
"A bit farther in than we'd planned to. You're going to be blocking a pass at the southern tip of that pine forest,"
she replied.
"On the way there is one more possible Karsite stronghold, but it's another wooden fortress. You can probably burn it out as we go by."
True, but he wouldn't be able to do so in a way that would ensure the Karsites got out before he sent it up. That's just too bad, he told himself, or tried to. They're the enemy, after all. They've killed plenty of our people without caring what happened. But had they? He couldn't say for certain if this particular batch of Karsites had been cold-blooded killers like those priests, or the assassin that had attacked Paul. They might just be ordinary folks, as troubled in their minds about dealing with death as he was. But if he left them in place, they would kill Valdemarans, whether or not they were troubled afterward. So he had no choice. Far sooner than he would have liked, the time to act came upon him. Fedor brought them all to a halt with an upraised arm and motioned to Lan to come up beside him.
"See that little dot of light?"
he asked, pointing to the mountainside. Lan sighted along his arm and nodded.
"That's the last Karsite post, and it's a wooden fort."
Fedor didn't bother to say anything more. Lan already knew what was needed. Lan gritted his teeth and steeled himself against what he was about to do to those unsuspecting Karsites in what they thought was a safe shelter.
Best to get this over with.
"I can't do this."
In memory, Ilya sobbed in Eleanor's arms, the recollection painfully clear in Lan's mind.
"Nothing I've tried is enough. I can't bring back his sight."
Never again will I hesitate.
The dragon came up in a rush of fury and flung itself at the proffered target. On the mountainside, a fire lily flung open hectic petals to the moon. His mind closed to anything other than the fires. Lan let the dragon have free play. At least they were far enough away that he couldn't hear the screams. Only when there was nothing left to burn did he haul the dragon back to its lair deep within his soul, only partly sated at best. He opened his eyes, grateful that he could not see the place where the fires had lately raged. Callum and Fedor put their heads together for a moment. Then Callum signaled to the rest of them to move forward behind Fedor. He and Wulaf headed up a trail toward the Karsite fortress to make certain that it had been cleared out.
"Steady on, love,"
Kalira said soothingly.
"You did just fine."
But she didn't say anything about the men in the fortress, and Lan added another load of guilt to the one he was already carrying. Striking without warning, without giving them a chance to surrender or flee. What am I becoming? Callum and Wulaf rejoined them some while later. It wouldn't have been at all difficult to see their trail, even with only moonlight to guide them. They weren't trying to hide it, after all. This would be the trail that the rest of the army would follow. And it was no odds if Karsites followed it as well. They'd either be met by fire from the scouts or fire from the army. At the pace they were setting, it was unlikely that anyone would overtake them anyway. Lan hadn't intended to sleep in the saddle, but evidently Kalira had already made up her mind about that. He wasn't riding anymore. In fact, he couldn't remember where he'd been or why he'd been riding. He and Kalira walked slowly and dreamily, side by side, but not touching, through a landscape that was too wild to be a garden, but too well ordered to be wilderness. Beside him moved a brightness, Kalira, and it seemed to him that she had always looked that way. He wasn't thinking much. His mind was entirely taken up with simply being. Golden light, thick and sweet, poured down over them. There were no other people here, but this wasn't a place that needed people. The birds, animals, and plants here acted as if they had never seen a human before. And Lan himself felt so entirely swathed in peace and loving warmth that he felt no urgency about anything. For that matter, he couldn't remember if there had ever been any urgency about anything. Perhaps he had always been here, and always would be. Then he woke, with the sunrise casting long blue shadows across the white faces of the mountains, the peace fleeing from him in a rush. He could have wept like a baby at being thrust back into this world, this horrible war. Then, although the peace did not return, the love and warmth did, flooding from Kalira into him. And if it did not return him to peace, it did comfort him. This looked pretty much like every other piece of country they had passed through, but Callum reined in his horse and looked about with satisfaction.
"Good. We've beaten them here," the scout leader said. "Most of you, rest. Lan, start a fire. Tuck, come with Wulaf, Fedor, and me. Let's find a place to put our young friend."
Lan climbed down from the saddle, feeling nowhere near as tired as the rest looked. While they wearily dismounted, he cobbled together as much deadfall as he could find and set it ablaze. As they gathered around, he and Kalira brought back large branches and logs and piled them on the roaring fire. By this third trip, someone had put water on for tea and broken out the field rations. He was happy enough to help himself to both, and it wasn't long until Callum returned. The scout squatted down beside the fire and accepted a mug from one of the others. Lan supplied Fedor and Tuck with food and drink as the scout drained his mug in a single swallow.
"We've got a good spot for you, lad, and just in the nick of time,"
Callum told him, passing his mug over for a refill.
"As soon as you get something into you, we'll take you up there and get you settled in. The Karsites will be here in about a candle mark, or so Fedor thinks."
Callum's casual statement chilled Lan to the bone, though he did his best not to show it. He gulped down his own tea, ignoring his scalded tongue, and bolted his ration bar. "I'm ready now," he said, putting on his bravest face.
"That's my Harold,"
Kalira crooned as he mounted, and he felt a little glow of pleasure warming the chill of fear. Dutifully they followed in Fedor's wake. Callum remained behind to direct the scouts to a place where they too could guard the pass. Tuck started to follow, but Fedor waved him back.
"We'll need you here, youngster,"
Fedor called over his shoulder as Lan turned to look back. Lan's job will be simple enough, and he won't need anyone to relay him orders." Tuck nodded and dismounted, gratefully accepting a second cup of tea. Lan sighed and faced forward again. He would have liked the company.
"Oh, now you always have me,"
Kalira replied.
"Besides, Tuck always feels bad when there's nothing for him to do."
"That's true enough, love,"
he replied, and Fedor motioned to him to come up beside him.
"This is a very narrow passage," Fedor said, as they rode side by side through a thick grove of pines. "You'll be able to stop them from coming through the pass directly, and we think you'll also be able to block most of the attempts to use the high passes, because you'll be able to see them from where we're putting you, and they shouldn't be able to get anywhere near you. You're going to be on a slope that had a rock slide in the last year or so. There is no kind of cover on it."
"Do you know much about what's coming?" he asked, rather shyly.
Fedor shook his head. "Only what they told me. All of the Karsite forces have consolidated for this, so I suppose this is their big push to break us. If that's true, winning here could win the war for us."
"Oh, I hope so," Lan said fervently. Fedor smiled, with understanding in his brown eyes.
"I hate this too," Fedor said softly. "That's one reason why I asked to be a scout. Blood makes me sick."
"It does?" Lan felt immensely better to hear a senior herald confess the same weakness he felt.
"I hate killing people," he said in a rush. "I hate it. I don't care if they're our enemies."
"And thank the gods you feel that way, Lan," Fedor said solemnly. "Anyone who doesn't is perilously near to becoming a monster. Most of these people wouldn't be fighting us if their leaders weren't forcing them, or at least telling them such lies that they're afraid we'll slaughter them if they don't get rid of us."
Lan wanted to talk more to him, but the trail narrowed at that point and he had to fall back to the rear. They came out of the pine trees onto the lower slope of the mountain, and began to climb it on a switchback path rising alternately through more trees and stretches of barren rock. Only a goat, a mountain pony, or a companion could have taken this route safely, and Lan's attention was entirely occupied by helping Kalira as she climbed by shifting his balance in the saddle like a tightrope walker on a rope. At times he hung over her neck, at others over to one side, or practically hanging off her tail. He kept his eyes down on the ground and on the sheer drop-offs just beyond Kalira's hooves. The trail didn't always switch back under itself, and even when it did, the likelihood of catching themselves if they started down was minimal. It wasn't until Fedor said, "We're here," that he looked up from the trail and gasped at the vista that unfolded before him. This place that Fedor and Callum had chosen for him was a little scooped-out section in the middle of the goat trail. A boulder might well have once been here and been knocked out of place by that rockfall. He had a perfect view of the passage between two snow-covered mountains and the zigzag valley below. A mist hung over the valley, glowing with the golden light of morning, filling the vale to a point halfway up the peaks. It wasn't a thick mist. He could see the sparkle of a river and the forms of trees perfectly well through it. The mist was nothing more than a tenuous, gilded veil that softened the edges of what lay beyond. A few puffy white clouds soared just above him, barely touching the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the distance a blackbird sang. For a fleeting moment, the peace of his dream descended on him. This was so beautiful, so peaceful. His soul opened up to it.
"Dear gods," Fedor murmured, "how I hate mankind sometimes."
Lan knew exactly what he meant by that. This peace, this loveliness, would be shattered irrevocably in a few candle marks, and for no more reason than that one group of men desired dominance over another.
"Make yourself as comfortable as you can, Lavan," Fedor said a bit louder, shaking himself out of his melancholy. "If you look up that way, you'll see the signs that they're coming. Then, well, do what seems best to you, and what you can to hold them back." Fedor smiled weakly. "No one knows better than I how unreliable gifts can be." Lan was touched and terrified at the same time by the trust implied by that order. He could, if he chose, do nothing, and claim that his gift had deserted him. Not that he would, but he could. Of course, if he didn't, more people would die. His own people. They wouldn't die at his hands, but they would die because of his neglect.
"You can depend on me, sir,"
he said solemnly. Fedor saluted him and turned his companion's head to go back down the trail. Well, if he was going to be here a while, there was no point in sitting on a lump of ice until he became one. Once again he gathered wood, this time from among the tumbled rocks where the remains of smashed trees poked up out of the boulders, the remains of a grove of pines that had once stood here. In no time he had a fine pile of dry, seasoned wood. He made a fire and warmed himself at it, while Kalira sidled up to the flames on the opposite side. From time to time he looked up to see if there was any sign of the enemy, but the fire had burned through the first feeding and halfway through the second before they appeared. A moving blackness, with bright glints of metal in the midst of it, crept forward imperceptibly at the farthest range of his vision. Again, a shiver of fear crept over him. Could he do this thing? He was only one person.
"You can."
Kalira came up close to him, supporting him with her shoulder. Together they watched the enemy approach, filling the entire valley from slope to slope, announcing their presence with trumpets that frightened the blackbird into silence. Black anger roiled sluggishly in his gut. They were a pollution, a desecration of this peaceful place. How dare they come here with their bows and swords, their war horns and their noise? How dare they trample this pristine place, churning up the untouched snow and leaving the landscape ruined? They poured through the valley in a sluggish stream with no end in sight. Not only were there glints from their weapons flashing among them, but bands of color from banners waving among them. And a safe distance from the front, something shining moved in the midst of them. Something bright gold, reflecting the sun, that almost seemed to float on the surface of the throng, bobbing in the current of humanity.
"That's a shrine to their god,"
Kalira informed him. "Oh, really?" he responded aloud, and a spirit of angered devilment suddenly took hold of them.
"Well, I think maybe they can do without it, don't you?"
A whicker and a toss of her head answered his question, and he reached out with his gift, feeling Kalira behind him acting as a check on his power. The shrine couldn't be solid gold, or no one would be able to move it. There was wood, even paper beneath that gilding, and where there was something, anything to burn, Lan would find it.
These people burn living sacrifices to that shrine. These people sent a man that took Paul's eyes.
There was less grief within him now, and more anger. Much more. He took a breath and loosed the dragon within him, targeting its fury on the shrine. For some time the army flowed forward, and nothing outwardly happened. But Lan felt the fire catch and take hold. He held it back to let it build, and then released it. An entire bouquet of fire blossoms burst forth from every opening in the shrine. Below, pandemonium. It looked exactly as if he had dropped a burning twig into a seething mass of ants. The little black specks that were enemy fighters surged away from the burning shrine in all directions as Lan fed the flames in glee. A few brave believers, full of bravado, tried to extinguish the flames by tossing snow on them, but soon gave up as the heat from the shrine drove them out of throwing distance. Would that give them pause? Would they decide to turn back, given the defeat of their god? No such luck. When the shrine was nothing but ash and puddled gold, the army of dots milled uncertainly for a little while, but the echo of shrill voices reached Lan's perch, and eventually the army crept forward again.
Damn.
Lan frowned, anger still controlled, but quickening. He'd hoped to finish this bloodlessly. Well, perhaps he still could. He called up his memories of the dark servants at the pass, of the attack on Paul, of Ilya's despair and Eleanor's grief, and let the anger build higher still. The dragon waited, not at all restless now, for it knew he was going to let it loose again, and this time it would have everything it wanted. Just before the first of the enemy reached the pass, a wall of flame erupted before them, 3 times the height of a man, stretching not only across the valley but a good way up the side of the mountains on either side. And as they recoiled from the fires, he saw something that raised the hair on the back of his neck and made his blood boil. In the front of the army was another line of those detestable priests, and just behind them a line of captives tied together by the neck, frightened fodder for their fires.
Oh, no, you won't.
With the surge in his temper, the line of fire below leapt up, rising in height and increasing in ferocity. Even the priests were forced back by the heat, and Lan had the bit in his teeth now. He'd burn the very stone of the mountains before he let them pass.
Hold hard, beloved.
That was Kalira, a bulwark supporting him. As he exhausted the fuel available in the line of fire, he crept it forward a pace, forcing the Karsite army back again.
There! Look there!
Without needing to be shown where to look, he glanced up the side of the mountain below him and saw a party of Karsites trying to establish a way around. In a flash, he sent the dragon out to chase them down again, and it looked almost as if an invisible creature was after them. Fire sprang up to bar their path, then followed them down to the floor of the valley. Lan let it spread. There was plenty of dry thatch for it to feed on, and as long as it didn't threaten the Valdemar forces, he no longer cared what it did. The tranquility of the mountains was already gone, and they had trampled the beauty under their feet. There was very little he could do that would spoil the valley more than it had been. Movement below caught his eye, and he set his chin when he realized that the priests were building their horrible bonfires, set in a line in front of the wall of fire. Now his temper truly rose, and in a fury he set the bonfires alight with an angry wave of his fist, then surged the firewall forward to engulf them.
Bastards!
He muttered through clenched teeth.
Not here, not now. Hellfires, not ever.
Gently, Lan,
Kalira warned, but he was past being gentle with people who burned innocents to call up devils. When another party tried to find a new way along the mountain opposite, he flamed the entire mountainside and grinned to see them tumbling and falling from the trail in their haste to get away.
You won't get past me, you bastards,
he crowed, giddy with intoxication.
Try, and you'll fry.
And he laughed, and spread his arms, daring them to make the attempt, while little flamelets filled the air around him. 24. Paul ached from head to toe, every muscle sore from riding, walking, and riding again. But he was well aware that every other member of the army felt the same aching exhaustion. Pushed ruthlessly until they were just about to drop, allowed a brief respite, which was never long enough, to plummet into sleep, then roused and pushed again, the army was, during most of the trek, composed of folk who only differed from walking corpses by having pulses. The Karsites had to cover roughly half the distance that the Valdemarans did in order to reach the next pass northward, and although their path was rougher, both armies were contending with the same winter conditions of ice, snow, and bitter cold. Cold could be as exhausting as marching. Huddled together in piles to conserve heat, wrapped in cloaks and blankets, the fighters hadn't a great deal of rest during their rest stops. Cavalry and heralds had it a little better, with companions and horses to snuggle up to, but it was still so bitterly cold it was hard to sleep. They'd gotten a full 8 candle marks of sleep in a complete camp with tents and fires at their last pause, though it had not made them into fresh men, just less exhausted ones. Now, with 4 candle marks of marching to bring them to the pass before them, their energy dared not flag. They daren't come up exhausted when no one knew what they'd face at the end of the march. Paul knew that the commanders had some hope that they'd be able to get more rest at the unnamed pass itself, but the Karsites had put on an unexpected burst of speed, and now the army was marching at a desperate pace to meet them. The only creature with any hope of standing between the Karsites and Valdemar was Lavan Firestorm. The Karsites were expected to reach the pass about now, early morning. The Valdemaran army hoped to arrive before noon. That was a lot of time for something to go wrong, a lot of time for Lan to exhaust himself or be captured.
Lan will not be captured,
Satiran said firmly.
Kalira would never allow it. He is holding the pass with surprising skill. The limiting factor is the amount of fuel for his fires.
If Lan exhausted the fuel, could he still hold the pass?
Kalira learned strategy from me. Lan learned it from you. We have to assume they won't do anything stupid.
Paul wished he had Satiran's self-assurance that what he had taught wasn't flawed. How long? He fretted. How long until we're there? Satiran raised his head from the trail and pointed his long nose at one mountain among many piercing the clear morning sky.
That's the peak that Lan is on. I think we will be there in 2 candle marks or thereabouts. Look, see the smoke.
Lan's fires produced very little smoke, burning as hot as they did, but through Satiran's eyes Paul saw there was a haze of smoke around the north side of the peak.
He's holding a barrier across the narrowest part of the pass.
Paul nodded. That was what he would have done. Depending on how long Lan could hold that barrier and how much he had to move it when the fuel was gone, he could keep the Karsites back for more than the couple of candle marks it would take for the army to reach him. Candle marks. That was too long, too long. He had to force himself to ride easily and not strain toward that far-off goal. What wouldn't I give for a way to get us all there now?
I can't reach Kalira.
It was Satiran's turn to fret, and Paul felt his muscles straining for a couple of strides until he realized it would be foolhardy to try and outrun the rest of the army. You already knew you wouldn't be able to, Paul reminded him. If he's holding something that large, she'll have all she can do to keep him under control. I wish they'd put Tuck up there with him, though. Satiran's sides heaved beneath his legs as his companion groaned.
But when the Karsites start breaking through, and they will, Tuck is more use down with the scouts.
Every horseman in the cavalry had a bowman up behind him, and these troops, with the heralds also carrying double with the exception of Paul, were the vanguard of the army. They were already making the best pace they could. Horses would break down under the pace a companion could set.
Paul, I want you to relay an order to the heralds,
the Lord Marshal said, cutting across his thoughts and fretting. Paul turned his bandaged eyes obediently towards the Lord Marshal riding on his right.
Sir. Send the heralds and their archers on ahead. I know that the companions can make better time than this, and it may be that a few men in place early can do more than many men arriving too late.
The Lord Marshal paused, and then continued.
You may go yourself if you wish.
Oh, he wished. Oh, how he wished. But blind as he was, he would be useless as a fighter, for not even Satiran could help him aim a bow, while here at the Lord Marshal's side he would be able to relay messages directly to the leader of their forces.
No, my lord, my place is with you, but allow me a moment. Heralds,
he called, his mind voice given strength by Satyron. "The Lord Marshal commands that you and your companions ride ahead, carrying your archers, to hold the line until the rest of us arrive." A ragged cheer greeted this order, and all across the front of the great mass of riders, silver-white companions and blue-clad archers leaped ahead like arrows speeding from bows. There were 100 or so heralds racing on ahead, with as many additional archers riding pillion behind. It was a thrilling and beautiful sight, the companions flying smoothly over the white snow, with shimmering manes and tails streaming behind them. They hardly seemed to touch the snow as they ran, with their heralds and archers bent closely down over their backs. Those archers were the finest master marksmen in Valdemar, and instead of baggage, they all carried extra quivers. As they vanished into the trees, Paul and Satyron yearned after them, sending all the strength they could spare to speed them on their way. Lan gnawed his lip in anger and frustration, tasting blood but feeling nothing but rage.
"Leave!"
he shouted at the tiny milling specks below.
"Why won't you leave?"
He sneezed as a wisp of smoke tickled his nose. He'd already shed his cloak and gloves. He wasn't cold anymore. Far from it. He didn't need the fire at his side to stay warm anymore. He'd held them in this narrow passage for as long as the fuel for his fires was there. He couldn't burn air. Well, he could, but not for long, and they still weren't giving up. He knew now to the thumb's length the size of the barrier he could hold, and if he moved it either farther back or farther forward where there was more fuel, some of them would be able to get around it. Damn! He sensed the fires below beginning to flicker, and prepared to move them. Then a plan flashed across his mind, whole and entire, and he grinned savagely and hugged Kalira's neck, letting her see and rejoice in it in a heartbeat before he put it into motion. He dropped the barrier altogether, gave them a flicker of time to gape in astonishment, another for their officers to order them forward. Then, with a whoosh like a windstorm, he flung up a new barrier just at the Valdemar side of the blackened, burned strip where there was still fuel left to catch fire. It nearly caught the foremost ones, and he laughed savagely to see them spill backward to escape being toasted. Kalira trembled beneath his arm in reaction to his anger, but the anger was what fed the fires, and he couldn't do this without it. Now he made a virtue of necessity as the fire crept back toward Valdemar, allowing a stretch of climbable slope to remain unprotected on the farther side of the mountain. Would they see it? Would they take the bait? Only fanatics would have scrambled up those tumbled, ice-covered rocks with a fire raging in their faces, but 20 or 30 of the Carsites did just that, and Lan allowed them to slip across. There were, after all, 20 or so Valdemaran scouts on this side, just waiting for a target that they could shoot full of arrows. But before anyone else took courage from that move, he slid the barrier over so that the gap was now on the opposite side. But this time it was a gap bordered by cliff on one side and fire on the other. Anyone who dared it would not be able to escape by climbing higher if the fires moved again. No one tried it. Not all the exhortations of the officers could force Karsite fighters into the jaws of that trap. Lan chuckled with angry pleasure as shouts came to him faintly from below. "Good. Fight among each other. The more you fight, the better for us." Perhaps it was the presence of the dark servants that kept the rank and file from revolting entirely against their leaders. Despite the loss of their shrine and their execution fires, the sinister priests remained at the forefront of the army, given wide berth by the common soldiers, but an ever-present threat against desertion. Perhaps there were more of them at the rear of the army. That would explain why Lan hadn't been able to get the Carsites to retreat.
"There are,"
Kalira said shortly.
"The Carsites fear their priests more than our fires. So far, they have been too busy preventing desertion to call up any of their demons. But if we give them a moment of rest, they will. They don't need a ritual fire. A knife to a victim's neck will do just as well.
More activity down below hinted that the leaders had gotten enough volunteers to agree to attempt the gap. So before they could try, Lan shifted the fire line backward and to the side again, closing the gap but leaving the slope open once more.
"Try it again, you bastards!"
He shouted down at them, keeping his anger as hot as the fires, though his knees quaked with exertion and his hands shook. He balled his trembling hands into fists and brandished them at the men below.
"Go ahead and see what you get!"
Paul, we're here in good time. Lavan holds the pass. He's letting small groups through, but we can take them.
Paul clenched both hands in Sataron's mane with relief.
"The heralds have gotten to the battlefield. Lavan is holding the pass, my lord," he said to the Lord Marshal. "Evidently he can't keep it completely blocked, but he's managing it so that only small groups are getting through at the moment, small enough that our heralds and archers can deal with them."
He sensed the Lord Marshal's relief, but it was only momentary.
"The boy can't hold forever,"
came the gruff reply. Paul heard nothing more, but knew that the Lord Marshal had retreated within himself, weighing alternate plans.
"Pass the word,"
Weldon said at last.
"I want the light cavalry to drop their archers and proceed ahead at their best speed. Have the heavy cavalry take the archers left behind at their stirrups."
A man hanging onto a stirrup could make better time than one without that aid. It would slow this group a bit, but the light cavalry, skirmishers all, were of more use sent ahead. They couldn't be more than a candle mark from the battlefield now. Sataron tossed his head with excitement as he and Paul watched the nimble, lightly built horses, black and sorrel, chestnut and gray, leaping forward into the snow. Blue-clad riders bent over their necks, blue and silver lance pennons lashing in the wind. Hooves thundered away into the trees ahead, leaving behind only the echoes of their departure rumbling between the mountains above and the churned-up snow below. The departure of the light cavalry seemed to somehow give more energy to the rest of the army. Or perhaps it was that the battle was so near at hand. But drooping heads came up, weary eyes sparked with excitement, and plodding feet found the strength to pick up the pace. More mind voices gave Paul information.
"He's moving the barrier again. About 100 got through this time. No casualties so far, but we haven't had close hand-to-hand yet. We're picking them off from a distance. Damn! Archers through this time. 1 scout, 3 archers down."
He relayed all this faithfully to the Lord Marshal, his voice tense with anxiety, although they both knew that these were the merest of skirmishes.
"The cavalry's here, and they're making mince of the Carsites."
That announcement sent a shiver of excitement through the entire army as it spread from man to man. Another surge of new energy, this time born of the rivalry between light and heavy cavalry, cavalry and foot soldiers.
"Come on, men!"
Paul heard someone shout back behind him.
"You want them prancing pony riders to steal all the glory?"
A roar answered the taunt, and the pace picked up yet again to something near what fresh men could manage. Paul and Sataron needed no urging to take a harder pace.
"They're coming through in larger groups now."
When Paul reported that, the Lord Marshal said nothing except,
"Listen, your ears are younger than mine. We've got to be getting near them. Can you hear the sounds of fighting yet?"
"No,"
Paul replied, as Sataron strained his neck forward, as if by doing so he could urge the army on faster than it was going already.
"Not yet."
But every step brought them nearer, and as he strained his ears trying to shut out the closer sounds of hoofbeats, jangle of harness, and grunting of men, he thought he heard something. They breasted their way through tall, thick-grown pines that towered over their heads and muffled sound, following on the track of the mounted fighters that had gone on ahead.
Paul looked up at the sky and the mountain ahead. The smoke was certainly closer.
"The barrier's too short. They're coming through."
"I hear them," Paul exclaimed, the faint echoes of shouts and shrieks, the clang of metal on metal finally penetrating the screen of trees. "They must be on the other side of the forest." That was enough. The Lord Marshal gave the signal to charge, and his trumpeter blared out the call, which was picked up by trumpeters all down the line and to the rear. With a roar as of one man, the army of Valdemar charged, beating their way past hanging boughs and lunging through the snow. Paul and the Lord Marshal were carried forward on the rush. Their momentum carried them through the trees and into a huge mountain meadow, a vast space of snow clotted with fighters. There was no mistaking the curtain of flame rising to their right, nor the horde of tiny figures pouring through on either side of it. In the midst of the meadow, the light cavalry charged, reformed, and charged again, keeping the Carsites already there from forming a defensive square and from launching a volley of arrows at the Valdemarans. Their own archers nearer the pass kept up a steady rain of deadly arrows on those who were pouring through on either side of the flames. The Lord Marshal's escort and guard shoved at the Lord Marshal and Paul, and by main force kept the little group from being carried along in the charge. They managed to get off to one side of the torrent of fighters, and a squire galloped off on his pony, searching for an elevation with a good view of the battlefield. He came back sooner than Paul expected and led them to a knee of the mountain where they arranged themselves, Paul and the Lord Marshal, surrounded by the bodyguard. Out in the meadow, the foot soldiers mopped up the nearest Carsites, then formed up in ranks while the heavy cavalry flattened the Carsites in mid-meadow, allowing the light cavalry time to regroup and face off the next wave coming in.
"Lan, where's Lan?"
Satyron looked up. There, above the pass and just visible where they stood, was a glint of fire and a minuscule doll-like companion and herald. Paul's first thought was that they were horribly conspicuous.
"So are we,"
Satyron reminded him grimly.
"So are all heralds, especially to Carsites."
Lan kept the barrier shifting, back and forth, trying to keep the Carsites from getting more than 20 or 30 men across at a time. He kept glancing at the Valdemar side of the barrier as well, hoping against hope that the scouts were not on the verge of being overwhelmed. The scouts were perched in a defensive group on high ground above the pass, where they were very difficult to come at, but commanded the field of fire. They'd taken that overlook right after Lan had let the first lot of Carsites through, and they'd seen what he was up to. The snow was littered with quiet, black-clad figures. The Carsites were still afraid to dare the gap at the cliff, though it was now twice as wide as it had been when Lan first opened it. They couldn't know, thank the gods, that going over the rocks was far more deadly.
The dark servants. I can't leave them free to act.
Now, if ever, was the time to find out if he could manage 2 fires at once. He slid the barrier over so that at least he didn't have to keep an eye on the Carsite fighters, and turned his attention to the nearest priest.
"You could always set fire to their robes,"
he heard Calira say in memory. But it was the priests who were responsible for all of this in the first place. Why should he let them escape harm while his own people, as well as the fighters the priests led, died? That thought lent him just the extra bit of anger he needed. A finger of flame lashed out from the barrier and caught the nearest priest, and for the first time, he met resistance. The flames splayed out in all directions as if they had struck a barrier just short of the priest, who raised his arms in a gesture of unmistakable triumph. With a roar that was audible above, the Carsites greeted this demonstration of their priest's power with hysterical relief.
"No, you don't."
Lan's response was a lash of rage that drove the dragon to even greater efforts. The wall of flame bulged, then erupted toward the priest, as the air itself ignited in a tentacle as thick as a house, completely engulfing the priest in his moment of triumph, even the air inside the priest's lungs afire. It was over in a flash, for Lan could not burn air for long, leaving behind a black and twisted shape on the ground, still burning with blue and gold flames dancing above it.
Yes!
Lan laughed aloud, watching the Karsites pull away from the remains of the priest. He glanced away to check on the scouts, and his heart leaped with joy to see the flood of reinforcements pouring out of the trees. 100 or more strong, they paused long enough to drop more archers on Lan's side of the pass, then formed up as a barrier along the edge of the trees. Ha! Lan moved his firewall again. This time it took the stunned Karsites a little longer to make the run for the opening, but the opening was much larger now, and more of them got through. As they ran, Lan caught sight of another priest near enough to the wall to make a try for. This one was quicker than the first, younger perhaps, and as the tongue of flame licked toward him he managed to sprint to safety. Lan growled deep in his throat, frustrated.
Lan, he ran from you. That alone will undermine him.
Perhaps, but he felt the same as a hawk whose rightful prey has somehow left him with nothing but a talonful of fur. Time to shift the barrier again. Fuel was running out. This time the gap between the cliff and the fire was too big and too tempting. For the first time, 50 or more Karsites flooded through, this time with the priest that had escaped Lan's fire chasing them from behind. Straight into the arrows of the new archers, and the priest was the first to fall. Lan jigged in place with savage joy. But there was no denying the fact that he was losing his effectiveness. Every time he shifted the barrier, more Karsites got through. Fighting below was no longer one-sided as more of the Karsites managed to survive the gauntlet of fire and arrows. It was no longer groups of 50 getting through, it was 100 or more, and the press of those on the other side of the barrier grew as it became clear that Lan wasn't creating the impassable defense it first seemed. Nor could he catch another priest unaware, though he tried, even tried to get them 2 and 3 at a time. They were aware of his reach now, and dashed out of the way at the first sign of activity in the barrier. By now they were over the burned area on their side of the barrier, and there was nothing to ignite beneath them. New motion on his side caught his attention. The light cavalry. He felt a surge of new energy as they charged through the trees and into the massed Karsite forces. He didn't dare watch for too long, but surely the rest of the army couldn't be too far behind.
Please, please come quickly.
It wouldn't be long now before his barrier reached a point where the mountainsides on both ends fell away, and it would be totally ineffective. Already the scouts and the Valdemaran archers had been forced to move to keep from being overrun by the flames.
Damn you! Leave us alone!
Oh, how he hated them. With every glimpse of a blue-clad body lying still in the snow, he hated them more.
Easy, Lan.
He was beyond Kalira's cautions now. The flamelets that had danced up and down his body flickered over him in a frenzy, filling the air around him and even skimming over Kalira's back. She didn't seem to notice. There was a red glow of flame in the back of her eyes, and every muscle was tense with strain.
What's that?
A roar from below, 100,000 voices shouting in triumph and challenge.
They're here! They're here!
He had to let them know that he saw them, and that he would still be fighting up here as long as he could stand, and that he was about to drop the barrier as ineffective. Paul tried calling again. Lan! Lan! Could the boy see them? Did he even notice anything but the flames? A flicker at the edges of the barrier warned him, just on the periphery of Satiron's vision. It flickered again, in a pattern of 3, 2, 3. Lan's using that to catch my attention.
Yes, since there's no one with the boy to relay what he's about to do, Satiron agreed. I think he wants to drop the fire curtain.
The barrier is coming down, Paul shouted, and repeated the warning in mind speech. The fire curtain's collapsing. Where?
Archers, fall back. Form arcs,
the Lord Marshal bellowed, and Paul and the trumpeters repeated that order as well.
Can Lan see this?
He wondered desperately, and mind sent with all his strength.
Lan, look down here. Give us time to get into position.
He could only watch and hope that Lan had heard him, or was already watching. The archers moved farther up on the mountainsides, or dropped back behind the foot soldiers. The cavalry, light and heavy together, dropped away from harassing the Karsites and withdrew to the right and left flanks. The foot soldiers moved up, archers behind them, and made a solid defensive line 10 men deep, planting their pikes firmly in the churned-up snow to await the Karsite charge. Abruptly, the flame curtain flickered and died. For a single dumbfounded moment, the Karsites stared at their enemies with nothing between them. There was a moment of utter silence. Not a man moved as the two armies stared at one another. Then one of the priests at the front of the group howled something, and the Karsites charged. Screaming curses, the Karsite forces poured through the pass in a solid black mass. Why had they chosen black as their color? Was it to contrast with heraldic white? To stand out against the snow? To intimidate? It was working. Paul sensed the Valdemarans shrinking back a pace from the flood of blackness that threatened to wash over and drown them all. There seemed to be no end to them. If the Valdemar forces hadn't already been at a fever pitch of excitement, the torrent of screaming men coming at them would have terrified even the hardiest. They surely outnumbered the Valdemarans by 3 or even 4 to 1. It terrified Paul. It took all of his willpower to sit calmly on Sateran and relay the Lord Marshal's orders. They couldn't count on Lan. The boy was surely exhausted by now and unable to do anything but watch. Before more than the first rank of Karsites had poured across the blackened line marking where the flame curtain had been, fires flared again, but this time in tall candles of fire that erupted violently out of the snow, then died to nothing, only to flare up somewhere else. They sprang up right in the path of the Karsites. They didn't do much damage, if anything, but they did break up the Karsite charge. Although a few fighters caught fire, rolling in the snow quickly put out their flaming clothing, but no man, having seen his fellow go up in flames, was quite as enthusiastic about running at the Valdemarans full tilt, at the risk of plunging into one of those fire fountains. Then, as the push from behind forced the front ranks onward, Lan changed his tactics. He brought up the curtain again, farther in toward the Valdemaran lines, but this time it was for a very different purpose. He caught a full line of 100 Karsites or more square in his fire line, and he held the flames on them. Even over the din of battle, Paul heard the dying screams of those men as they tried to escape the inferno and failed, and his stomach lurched as the smell of burned flesh came to his nose.
"Oh, dear gods,"
Paul breathed. Lan had not deliberately called fire down on the Karsites and burned them until this moment. What had made him do it now? The wall of flame died, leaving behind not only a blackened strip of land, but charred and twisted corpses lining it. The fire curtain was gone, but this time the Karsites held back, despite the threats of their priests. They seemed to have figured out that if they were within the stretch where the curtain had already burned, they were safe. For a moment, it looked as if the Karsites were at an impasse. They couldn't retreat, but they were not going to charge either. Then a trumpet sounded an unfamiliar call. The priests screamed an order, and they started coming on again. But now they charged forward in small groups of 20 or 30, too many groups and too widely separated for Lan to stop with his flame wall. Lan wasn't going to give in. He sent up fire fountains again, intercepting as many of the little groups as he could, and once again shrill and terrified screams rang out above the general mayhem. No one but Paul seemed disturbed by this change in Lan's tactics. In fact, from the Lord Marshal's muttered comments and the shouts of encouragement out on the field, there were plenty who were cheering him on. What's happening up there? Sateran, prompted by Paul's unease, looked up to the place where Lan and Kalira perched. It was only the sense that something was wrong with Lan that prompted him to look up there, nothing more. But he saw, or thought he saw, something. He wasn't certain what it was, a movement among the rocks where nothing should have been, perhaps a man-shaped shadow behind them. He might not have seen anything. He did have a touch of foresight along with everything else, and it might only have been that foresight had warned him. All he knew was that suddenly his unease turned to horror. He knew that tragedy was a heartbeat away. Terror closed his throat, tasting bitter, and he tried, desperately, to project a warning into Lan's impervious mind.
Lan! Lan! Hide! Run!
Lan was the dragon. Driven by hunger that only increased with every new victim, he hunted the battlefield, pouncing on target after target, reveling in the screams of the hurt and dying, then going on to new prey. Flame filled his mind and soul, burning with unholy joy, insatiable rage. He had but one thought now. He would burn the world, if that was what it took, until the last of the enemy was ashes. Although Satyron's eyes were fixed on the pair above, Paul wasn't the only herald to know, suddenly, that catastrophe was about to strike. The battlefield was disordered. Now relative disorder became absolute chaos.
The hell!
The Lord Marshal exclaimed. All over the field, Valdemaran trumpeters called retreat, though no orders had been given for retreat. A dozen mind speakers bombarded Paul with panic-stricken calls to flee, then broadcast their warnings at full strength to anyone who could hear. Valdemaran fighters across the battlefield broke off their engagements and fled in no order at all, while beside Paul the Lord Marshal sputtered. Paul stretched out his arm to Lan and Kalira in a futile effort to stop what was coming. A dark speck flitted across the distance from a shadow that might have been man-shaped to the young herald. Only a speck. Insignificant.
What?
Something grabbed Lan and shook him. Distracted, he glanced aside. Just as a heavy crossbow bolt thudded into Kalira's chest. All breath driven out of her, she could only gasp and throw up her head in pain, but her mind screamed, "Lan!" Too late. She flung her head around to stare at him as he scrambled to reach her. Her eyes clouded with agony as she collapsed, but her gaze caught and held his. He reached frantically for her, but he couldn't hold her. A greater power than his wrenched her away from him. He only heard her, fainter with each word, as her eyes closed for the last time.
I love you.
Then she was gone. Up on the mountainside, the tiny figure of the companion crumpled and fell with a single heart-rending cry that Paul heard only in his mind, a cry cut off with the finality of death. Up on the mountainside, Lan crumpled beside his lifeless companion. It was not mind-speech as such that cut across the brains of every living creature in and around the battlefield. It was a mental howl of anguish, of grief, of terror. It drove tears into unwilling eyes and sent some to their knees in the snow. It triggered the worst memories of every person on the field, Valdemaran and Karsite alike. Paul clasped both hands to his head as the cry cut into his very soul. It went on and on, a grief like a sword cutting him in a million pieces. And it was not sane. Then, fire, elemental, unstoppable, came to earth. It exploded down out of the sky and drove down on the Karsites like the very hammer of the gods. It spewed up out of the snow to meet the down-rushing flames of the sky fires. In a single moment it transformed the entire side of the mountain to a furnace, an inferno, and it spread from there faster than a man could run. Gods. Now Paul knew why heralds had seized trumpets to sound retreat, and mind voices had sent the Valdemaran forces scattering for their lives. Foresight had given them the warning that something apocalyptic was about to happen, but not what, nor in time to prevent it. Fire exploded down the mountain in an avalanche of flames. Lan lay over Kalira's body, the dragon unleashed, unfettered, and free to ravage as it willed. All of his grief, rage, and hatred filled it and gave it a power beyond anyone's direst nightmare. So long as it consumed him, he was beyond caring.
Wait for me, beloved. I'm coming. But first, I will avenge you.
He closed his eyes, gave himself over to the dragon, and set the world and himself with it aflame.
Kalira!
Satyron, lost in his own grief, shuddered once, then lifted his head to the sky and keened out his loss to the heavens. Paul wanted to howl with him. Kalira was dead, struck down by a Karsite assassin's arrow. Lavan Firestorm had nothing to help him control his powers, and with the death of his life-bonded companion, no reason to want to, no reason to live. He needed no fuel for his fires now. He could burn the rock of the mountains if he chose, burn the very air itself. The fire had a voice. It howled like millions of damned souls. It had a mind, and the mind was mad. Karsite and Valdemaran alike scrambled to escape the battlefield before the fires caught them. From the ground to the mountaintop there was nothing but flame. Fire churned and roiled, fire roared and shrieked, fire filled the sky. Vortices of flame twisted, hellish dancers with the grace of a streamer in the wind and the appetite of a demon. Even as Paul watched through his companion's eyes, Satyron's voice keening on and on in his mind and ears, those nearest the flames were suddenly sucked up by a wind, or the firestorm itself, inhaling, pulled off their feet into the air and then screaming into the maelstrom. Gods. The maelstrom pulsed once like a spasming heart and enlarged again. Bits of burning debris rained down around him, kicked out of the top of the vortex. Fiery twigs, ashes, coals, and cinders. The bright glowing skeletons of pine cones. Once, horribly, a burning human arm that landed with a dreadful sizzle in the melted snow beside him. Paul could only sit and stare, numb with horror, paralyzed with grief. Satyron keened on, trembling, oblivious to anything else. Something tugged at his arm, nearly pulling him from the saddle.
"Come on, man!"
the Lord Marshal's squire shouted in his ear when he didn't respond.
"Come on! If you stay here, you'll cook!"
The heat from the inferno was incredible. The snow turned to steam before Satyron's eyes, the ends of the pine needles around him curled up. The firestorm pulsed again, spasming and expanded once more.
"Come on!"
the squire shouted again to Paul. Then, heroically, he seized Satyron's bridle and forced the companion's head around.
"Come on, you stupid git!"
he screamed, kicking Satyron in the side.
"Move! Move!"
Neither of them could move on their own, but the squire was not to be denied. He tied Satyron's reins to his saddle, and his pony dragged Satyron behind him by main force as they joined the flight to safety. With a terrible moan, Satyron broke the connection between himself and his herald, leaving Paul in darkness, intolerable anguish and bleakness of heart and soul to match the dark behind his eyes. He simply clung to the saddle, bent and broken, weeping hoarsely, as he had not been able to weep for himself. and it seemed to him that he would never find his way out of the darkness and the grief. His tears scalded his eyes, soaked through his bandage, and still they fell. He tasted their salt on his lips, bitter and harsh, but no more bitter than his heart. Satyron trembled under his legs, shaking as if the companion, too, sobbed. How long he sank into that hell of grief he didn't know. Suddenly there were hands on his arms and voices urging him to dismount. The roar of the fire was gone, and the air, cooler now, was scented with scorched rock. He slid off Satyron's back into arms waiting to catch him. Ilya's arms. He crumbled into her embrace, and gave himself and his grief into her care. Satyron collapsed beside him. Ilya helped him down to the snow, where he blindly groped for his companion's neck and wrapped his arms around it, as Ilya cradled both of them, crooning wordlessly. Out of the chaos of shouting and noises around him, a single voice cut through his grief. "Paul! Paul!" He raised his head, responding to the frantic sound of Tuck's voice. "Paul!" The boy's hands were on his shoulders, pulling at his tunic, despite Ilya's attempts to stave him off. "Paul, what happened to Lan? They dragged me away and won't let me go back. This guard here won't let go of me. What's going on?" He tried to answer, but could not get a word out of his throat. But an answer came. Paul had heard the death bell in the grove toll before. He knew the sound of it as well as he knew the sound of his own name. But he had never before heard it with his heart, and never at such a distance from Haven.
Every herald across the land must be hearing it.
It vibrated through him, somber, throbbing with unshed tears, and there was no doubt in his mind who it tolled for. Tuck collapsed beside him with a sob, and Ilya held them all while they wept until they could weep no more. It was 4 days before Paul could stand and walk again. 4 days before Satyron, surrounded by all the comfort the rest of the companions could give, was able to act as his herald's eyes again. 4 days of sleep and grief, while the shattered army of Valdemar pulled itself back together and put together the pieces of what had happened. The only Karsite officer to survive the inferno had confessed that once the source of the hellfires had been identified, a hand-picked set of marksmen had been sent up the mountain with orders to shoot not the herald, but the companion. The priests wanted the secret of the fires, and they knew the quickest way to disable a herald was to slay his demon horse. The firestorm raged for no more than a candle mark, but in that short time it destroyed everything on the mountain and in the pass below it. Where there had been a pine forest, there was now a totally lifeless plain, with no sign of anything but ashes, no remains, no smoldering tree stumps, nothing. Everything from the ground up had been reduced to gray-white powder. As Paul woke on the morning of the 5th day and struggled for the first time to sit up, Ilya told him all this in a few stark sentences.
"Eleanor,"
he ventured.
"We were in the rear, with the baggage,"
Ilya pointed out.
"I don't think she had any idea what was happening until the firestorm, and I don't think she even realized then what had happened until she saw you and Satyron."
Paul fumbled for her hands and found them clasped tightly together in Ilya's lap. He coaxed them apart.
"And?"
he prompted hoarsely, his voice ravaged by weeping.
"And she's taking it hard."
That, and the softening of Ilya's stiff pose, bringing her into his arms where she finally wept, told him all he needed to know.
"I know this doesn't help now, but she'll recover, though I doubt she thinks she can. We all will."
He held her close and let her cry herself out, she who so seldom wept, and more often for others than herself. He let her cry until she was exhausted, which took so little time that he knew she had been staying sleepless at his side until this moment. Then he made her curl up in his place, and stayed beside her until she slept.
"Satyron,"
he called then, hesitantly, not certain that he would have an answer.
"Coming?"
was the reply, lead-heavy with mourning, but at least it was a reply. He heard plodding hoofbeats outside his tent, then, blessedly, vision returned, the view of his tent from Satyron's eyes. He stumbled to his feet, through the tent flaps, and flung both arms around Satyron's neck. When they both emerged from a sea of mourning, and took notice of the rest of the world again, Satyron rubbed his soft nose against Paul's cheek, tasting his tears.
"They want to send Fedor up the mountain this morning,"
Satyron said hesitantly,
"to see what is there. Tuck wants to go, and Eleanor, and the rest of the scouts. Elia is going with Eleanor. Do you?"
He already knew that Satyron did, and he did not want his oldest and dearest friend to go alone.
"Of course I do,"
he said instantly. The sad little cortege made its way up the side of the mountain, unimpeded by snow, ice, or trees. It was the most utterly lifeless place that Paul had ever seen. Not a bird, not an animal, not even an insect. The total silence made the ears ring and made Paul shiver. But when it came time to climb the last bit of the trail, there was a problem. The heat of the fire had cracked the rocks and made the trail unstable and too dangerous to try. But Wulaf, the shepherd-turned-scout, stared at the trail with his jaw set.
"Gimme yon box,"
he told Fedor, who wordlessly brought over a beautifully carved box that had held the Lord Marshal's seal until that morning, and handed it to him. The boy stuffed the box into the front of his sheepskin jacket, dismounted from his pony, and took his shoes off. Before anyone could move, he was scrambling over the rocks above the trail and out of sight. He was back before Paul could start to worry.
"'Tis same as the pass, naught but ash,"
he said quietly, taking the time to put his sheepskin boots back on over his stockinged feet. Wordlessly, he handed Fedor the box. Eleanor sobbed into her mother's shoulder. Tuck's red cheeks were lined with tear streaks. He didn't open it, and no one asked him to. All eyes turned to Paul, who swallowed down his tears.
"Well,"
he said at last,
"let's take them home."
Epilogue. Paul and Ilya picked their way along the goat trail to the place on the mountain where Lavan Firestorm and Kalira had died, with Satyron pacing alongside, though Paul no longer needed his eyes. Intensive work by the healers had given him back the use of his own, although his vision would never be as good as it once had been. He never knew from what sources of strength Ilya found the way to heal him, nor from where the healers she recruited got the knowledge they needed to do so. But he could see again, however imperfectly. It was the same procession that had gone up the mountain to be thwarted by the unstable trail, for the shepherds of this area under Wulaf's direction had worked all these months to make it safe for them to return. But there was a new addition, for Tuck had brought Lan's sister Macy, who rode pillion behind him. Eleanor had accepted no consolation whatever for about a month, but then, surprising even herself, she came to the end of her tears. Perhaps it was because it was difficult to sustain the illusion of an undying love on notes like, "Thank you for the headache potion, but can't you make it taste any better than that?" Macy and Tuck helped her and each other, and Macy moved out of her parents' home and into the palace as a member of the Queen's household, one of Queen Phyllis's personal embroiderers. It was a more comfortable place for her than her own home, and kept her near the people her brother had loved best. When spring brought life back to Valdemar, and Wulaf sent word that the trail was safe, there was no question that they would all go. And now, once again, they rode single file through the blasted pass. The ancient pine forest was completely destroyed, from the tallest tree to the earth itself, to a depth of the height of a man, as an experimental trench proved. Nothing would grow in the soil. Perhaps nothing ever would again. There had been no sign of Karsite activity anywhere along the border. Then again, so much of the army and priesthood had been destroyed, it wasn't likely that this son of the sun would be able to hold his preeminence much longer. The trail they rode now, although they had to go single file, was far from the goat track Paul had first seen. This was a real trail, lovingly smoothed by hand and pick, that even an aged pony could follow. The shepherd's memorial to the one who saved us, Paul thought, with a painful lump in his throat. There might be more impressive memorials, but never one created with more sincerity and heart.
"Here,"
Wulaf said, pausing in a shallow dish-like depression halfway up the side of the mountain.
"This be the place."
Paul squinted, peering down at the pass, wondering what had happened up here. Something had happened to Lan even before Kalira's death. A touch of encroaching madness, perhaps.
If I had been here, could I have prevented that? And if I had been here, wouldn't Satiran and I have detected the marksman, even cloaked by the dark servants?
He, Tuck, and Satiran had pummeled themselves with might-have-beens for the past several months, with no answers to be found. It didn't look as if he would find any in this barren place either.
"Look!"
exclaimed Ilya behind him. He turned to see her cupping something between her hands down in the ash. He knelt down beside her. It was a seedling, a tiny speck of green with 2 minuscule leaves.
"It's a fire cone,"
Ilya said softly.
"They're very rare, even here. It takes a fire to free the seeds from the cone, and even then, more seeds burn than ever sprout. It must have been here for years before—"
"Before it was freed,"
Paul finished for her, looking at the tiny thing with wonder.
"But how it got here, of all places?"
Ilya shook her head.
"There's no way of telling." "Should we take it back with us?"
Eleanor asked, and a momentary thought of transplanting this bit of life and hope to the grave that held only ashes flickered through his mind.
"No,"
Ilya said.
"it would never live. It needs ashes, mountain winds and winter storms to thrive. Look."
She scraped the ashes away from the bare rock to show how it was cracked and crazed.
"This is what it needs. It can send its roots deep into the rock and rise out of the ashes tall and strong."
She patted the ashes around the seedling with a motion that was almost affectionate, then carefully dripped water into the mound of ashes from her water bottle.
"It needs adversity to thrive."
He held out his hand to her, and she used it to get to her feet.
"Something like Valdemar."
She smiled, and if her smile held sorrow, it also held joy.
"And something like us. All of us."
"All,"
Satiran confirmed.
"all of us, together."
For one last moment they looked out over the mountains, wondering when adversity would cross them to find Valdemar again.
"It won't be soon. Lan bought us that. Peace, for a while."
"And thanks to Lan, for a time we will have pace to grow,"
Tuck said with unusual eloquence. Paul nodded and moved to put his arm around Tuck's shoulders.
"Yes, we will,"
he replied,
"just like this little tree. If it hadn't been for Lavan Firestorm,
neither we nor the tree would still be here. They stood together in the silence for a long time, each of them with his own thoughts. Wulaf was the first to move, collecting a handful of pebbles and carefully ringing the seedling with a protective barrier. Fedor did the same, then added the silver arrowpin of a royal messenger, burying it in the ash within the circle. One by one, they each built the wall of protection a little higher and thicker, some adding tiny keepsakes to the ashes. When Eleanor's turn came, with only Paul and Ilya to go, she added a covering of paper torn into the tiniest of scraps, then wetted with water from her water bottle to the top of the ashes to keep them from blowing away. Paul had a fairly good idea where the paper came from, for she had brought Lan's few notes with her, and he had noticed her shredding paper as the others made their offerings. Ilya simply held her hands over the seedling, giving it the strength only a healer could impart. Then it was Paul's turn. He slipped over the seedling a thin bracelet that Macy had made for him, braided of his hair and Satyran's together. He hadn't come here with the intention of leaving it, but it seemed right. He straightened up and met the eyes of each of the others in silence. Now he sensed that some deep wound in each of them had begun to heal. It was not closed yet, but in time they would all be whole. "Time to go," he said quietly, and they turned their faces home. This concludes Brightly Burning by Mercedes Lackey, narrated by Daniel Thomas May. Copyright 2000 by Mercedes R. Lackey. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Daw Books Incorporated and was produced in the year 2020 by Tantor Media Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.